Sup you sinister folks, welcome to the part 2, of What If Deku's Cursed Blood, Could You Know Reverse Death, Chapter 4 A Sinister Friendship. Shouta Aizawa, pro hero codenamer Acerhead, eyed his newest batch of wannabe students with some reservation. They might have taken his threat of expulsion better than some of their predecessors, but he still fully intended to discern their individual potentials, if they had any. One of the reasons he even bothered teaching at UA was because it gave him the perfect justification to seek out and prevent future disasters from happening. People with quirks they didn't understand or didn't care to control often ended up at the academy for one reason or another. Spotting these kinds of brats so that they could be handled properly away from the delicate public was worth his time. When he'd been assigned 1A again, he'd done his usual research into the incoming students' files, and found a few that had caught his eye. One, in particular, stood out for a variety of reasons. Izuku Midoriya, the boy with a troubled past. The kid lacked a true understanding of his quirk, made use of a reanimated corpse he'd watched killed in front of him, and while clearly some finer details had been left out, spent most of his school career as a lone wolf. While the practical exam had revealed his budding heroic heart, the unknown limits of the teen's zombification abilities worried him. A history of suspected bullying, isolation, and trauma only increased the risks of villainous potential. "Return to your spot, Midoriya," Aizawa said, shaking himself from his thoughts. "And remember, keep your pet under control. Or, failing that, be quick to warn me if your control slips." The grizzled pro's sharp eyes caught the grinding of the green-haired teen's teeth at the referral of the reanimated corpse as a pet. He added a mental note to Midoriya's file that his relationship with the undead girl was viewed as more meaningful than previously recorded. Thankfully, after a firm nod, the boy went to join the rest of his classmates. Out of the corner of his eye, Aizawa suddenly noticed the movements of a spiky blonde. He wasn't anywhere near naive enough to believe the scowling boy wanted to give his classmate a friendly handshake. "Fucking Romero. I'm going to." Bakugo's rage sputtered out before it could really ignite. Nothing had happened. He was pointing an open palm at the freak but nothing was happening. What the foo? The spiky blonde's cursing was cut off as bandage-like cloth abruptly wrapped around him. No matter how much he struggled, the cloth held and he couldn't break free. In fact, the more he struggled the more tangled he became. "And what exactly were you trying to do?" Aizawa growled lowly, a hint of real anger crossing his expressionless face. "Attacking or harming a fellow student or member of the staff outside of training exercises is grounds for immediate expulsion." Those currently not tied up like a mummy watched on as Bakugo was completely enveloped by Aizawa's seriously long scarf. The caught blonde, finally realizing the futility of his actions and recognizing the threat in his teacher's words, roughly ceased his struggling. He settled for glaring at the man. Hoping his point had been made, Aizawa released his captive, only to immediately wish he hadn't. Harming? That kind of thing doesn't apply to that abomination and his sick zombie thing. Bakugo spat out. His disturbing words, delivered in such a disturbing fashion, quickly earned the disgust of the watching students. Aizawa stood, silently examining what he belatedly realized was another potential villain problem. "Midoriya, are you immune to or resistant to pain?" Asked with all the seriousness of the grave, the question caught everyone off guard. Those who hadn't met Izuku before were confused. Shouldn't the green-haired teen share the durability of his zombie girl? The imposing boy with glasses, and more so Okako, knew better. But even they were horrified when their classmate responded. "Taichan's pain receptors seem to be non-functional according to all current means of analysis," Izuku was quick to reveal, "but I can feel pain just like a normal person, sir." That was the truth, sort of. No one really knew if the zombie girl felt pain anymore since they couldn't ask her and she never reacted to injuries. It was merely a best guess. Meanwhile, Aizawa was nodding his head at the expected answer. "Regenerators can build up their pain tolerance, just like everybody else. But that's no excuse to harm them, the pro hero said, staring at the aggravated blonde. Katsuki Bakugo, the rules apply to everyone here. Consider this your only warning. With that, the issue was settled, though Aizawa noticed quite a few new developments amongst his wannabe students. Thanks to his experiences as a pro hero, Aizawa had plenty of practice at and aptitude for reading body language. In that regard, the teens before him were open books. From the psychotic rage rolling off of Bakugo, to the forced resignation exuding from Midoriya, he could see an entire story being written before his very eyes. The two clearly had history. The Verdanet's acceptance of the blonde's behavior didn't come off as someone unable to defend themselves, but more like someone who'd repeatedly been disallowed from going on the defensive. The exhausted teacher added another mental note, this time to remember to dig up any hidden info on these two. No doubt staff at their previous schools had a hand in things escalating this far. What really concerned Aizawa, though, was the zombie. As Bakugo had attempted to use his quirk, he'd clearly seen the undead girl tense up, ready to take action should violence break out. His unease stemmed from one simple fact: there hadn't been any verbal commands from Midoriya for it to react to in that instant. That went better than expected, Izuku muttered to himself as he and Tei reached their classmates. Looking up, the green-haired teen realized the entire group was staring at him. To be able to control your darkness to such a fine degree, and with such finesse. A boy with the head of a raven greeted him first, sounding quite friendly. I salute you. That was an incredibly creative use of your quirk, a tall girl with a wild, spiky black ponytail agreed. More people should learn to think like you. The green-haired teen was speechless at the continued support. Coolda bean, better, the crimson-haired boy with sharp teeth added, more nonchalantly than antagonizing. You shoulda had her throw it for you. Not everyone uses brute force to solve their problems, the girl with cute frog features defended, taking Izuku's side to his amazement. There's nothing wrong with being imaginative, Karo. Aizawa, seeing his wannabes getting distracted, tabled his current thoughts and pinched the bridge of his nose. He'd taken his hands off the reins for 1 second. Enough chit-chat. The gruff teacher interrupted, returning the feeling of dread to the students. Play friends after you've survived the day. Uncount. Izuku only nodded at the words, thumb and forefinger cupping his chin. As expected of the pro-hero Eraserhead, the green-haired teen said to the surprise of his classmates. And teacher. No room for nonsense. Oh? So you know who I am? Aizawa asked, actually interested that some kid had recognized him. He was an underground hero for a reason. And what gave it away? Or did you guess? Izuku shook his head in the negative, stepping to the side so the rest of the class could see him. He held out a fist, palm up. Wears specialized goggles, around the neck that don't look like they'd impair vision. One finger shot up. Uses a capture tool that's disguised as a simple and plain scarf that's easy to wear and move around. 2 fingers. A quirk is suddenly unable to be activated without explanation. 3 fingers. And, I apologize sir, but I don't think any one of us recognize your face even though we know you have to be a pro to teach here. A 4th and final finger rose up. Izuku smiled. I can't think of another hero that fits all of those descriptions, the green-haired teen announced, earning a small smirk from the underground hero. His classmates continued to stare. Aizawa suddenly turned to his gaping wannabes, bloodshot eyes wide and frightening. Enough talk. Get ready to show me what you can do. Returned to the task at hand, the hopefully future class of 1A went about carrying out the orders for the different tests. Aizawa took more mental notes as his wannabes tackled their tests. Some preferred a direct approach, others showcased their creativity, and a few even exhibited balanced skill and ingenuity. As the school day approached its end, the pro-hero already had a pretty good idea on how to guide a few of the more obvious talents he'd been given. Tenya Ida, who came off to those around him as imposing with his stern look and glasses, has scored highest in the 50-meter dash and above average in the long jump. He'd revealed himself to be rather narrow-minded, however, playing by the book a little too much without any consideration for imaginative solutions. Tackling the tests as ordered was all well and good, but a hero needed to be open to all alternatives in every situation. Okako Uraraka, a brunette with perpetually rosy cheeks, had completely bested everyone at the softball throw. He was a little miffed that she'd sent the test module into low orbit, but it showcased her quirk's ability, so he'd gotten over it. She'd also managed to score the best at the long jump, but he'd noticed that the longer she used her quirk, the sicker she appeared to get. Definitely something to work on in the near future. Momo Yarazu, his most mature-looking wannabe, had shown without a doubt that she deserved the recommendation she'd received. The tall girl had scored high marks in most tests, making excellent use of her quirk to fabricate any and all tools that could make her life easier. She demonstrated higher than average physical conditioning as well, managing to excel even in situations her quirk couldn't be used. He'd have to focus on her speed though, both physically and in quirk use. She was the slowest in the class at the moment. Shitoto Toraki, the heterochromatic with a history probably on par with Midoriya's and what hadn't been recorded. His dual hair color stood out, as did the scar over his left eye, but his high marks spoke louder of his ability. The kicker with the boy was that he absolutely refused to use half of his quirk, a mindset that needed to be addressed sooner rather than later. Tsuyasui, a shorter girl whose quirk gave her frog-like features, was what Aizawa would appreciate all average heroes aspiring to be. She'd easily scored above most of her classmates, easily enough that it was clear she was holding back strength and skill to spare. He decided she'd make a fine standard to grade everyone else against. Izuku Midoriya, the top scorer in the practical exam, had managed to surprise him more than once with how he tackled the tests. The softball throw had been just a peek into the mind of the teen, a glimpse at a creativity that was rare to see these days. Having himself thrown by his zombie for the long jump, achieving a respectably above-average distance, was a sight to see. So too was watching the undead girl easily match said distance with little effort. Above average. That term applied to Midoriya in almost every test now that he thought about it. The endurance tests had presented interesting results of course, such as, the green-haired teen would have everyone beat on number of repetitions made, but not speed, and that he could do all of this without sweating or showing signs of muscle fatigue. He didn't know what to make of the zombie matching his wannabe in perfect imitation. Something doesn't feel right, Aizawa muttered, glancing at the now exhausted students, specifically the green-haired teen. Every test he'd noticed it more and more, the zombie seemed to act with a degree of autonomy more akin to a thrall of a minion, pet quirk than a creation of a zombification quirk. She wasn't only obedient, she could react on her own. Which didn't make any sense at all with Midoriya's quirk registered as blood repair. The file only said the teen's blood repaired biological structures it came into contact with, unsettling as that apparently allowed him to reanimate corpses to do his bidding. But the problem with that description was it failed to explain the behavior of the zombie. The undead girl acted more like loyal pet, not a mindless puppet. Sometimes he hated how ineffectual the QRA proved themselves to be when handling delicate matters such as this. Not right in the slightest, Aizawa muttered a second time, now taking note of Katsuki Bakugo. The explosive blonde had spent the entire time glaring at anyone who managed to best him in even one test, which meant at this point almost everyone had drawn his ire in some fashion. He knew the type, had seen it 100 times before, the top dog of middle school who couldn't come to terms with the truth of the real world. To be honest, he'd expected it to have been Endeavor's kid, not a random upstart. Okay then, Aizawa called out, drawing the attention of his wannabes. Once the teens were all looking at him, the gruff teacher clicked a button on his phone's screen. An innocent B-plater, and a holographic display board popped into existence. In 2 columns of 10, the student hopefuls were ranked. These are the results for today, the pro hero announced, taking in the stressed looks as each wannabe desperately searched for their name. Logically, If they'd been thinking, the only name that should matter to them was the bottom one. On that note, about last place being expelled, Izuku took in the sight of his name, sitting comfortably at 7th, with a smile. He felt good. He and Tay had earned that spot, together through all their hard work. But he knew he still had a long way to go before he'd earn the title of hero. This was just another step. Contrary to the green-haired boy, the shortest member of the class, Minoru Mineta, had collapsed to his knees. To his absolute horror, it was his name he found at the 20th spot on the list. Only now did he truly regret skipping all those gym days in middle school. It was a lie, Aizawa revealed, just something to incentivize you all to go beyond your self-imposed limitations. Too tired to cause much of a scene, the now official members of Class 1A still made their disbelief at what they were being told known. It wasn't true? Kyo Kajiro asked, her earjacks writhing like agitated snakes. The punk rock girl obviously felt relieved, but, at the same time strangely cheated. Crossing her arms under her developed chest, Momo nodded in agreement, before looking down in shame. If you think about it, it was kind of obvious, the mature girl said, sure in her belief that a prestigious academy wouldn't risk its image by expelling students on the first day. I'm sorry for not saying anything earlier. Uncaring as to the veracity of the girl's belief, Aizawa turned to leave. The pro-hero had a lot to consider with this batch of students, not to mention warnings to pass around during his debrief with the rest of the freshman teachers. He'd bet his melatonin that at least one of his co-workers weren't aware of the zombie or the explosive kid. Izuku himself wasn't quite sure what he thought about Momo's declaration, but decided, fretting over it wouldn't do anyone any good now. Ready to call it today, the green-haired teen just wanted to follow his classmates back to the locker rooms in peace, change, and go home. His classmates, on the other hand, had other plans. Midoriya, the teen with the raven head, Fumikage Tokoyami, said suddenly, coming up to the boy in question out of the blue, as a fellow master of the darkness, I cannot help but dwell upon the curiosity that is your control over your undead servant. Would you grant me the honor of revealing your methods? 1A had by this point split to their separate locker rooms. Izuku, half changed, nearly fell over when he realized the raven-headed teen's inquiry had earned them the attention of some of the other boys. He kind of couldn't blame them though. He supposed they'd noticed Tay waiting just outside the locker room. Master of... Wait. Are you talking about Tay-chan? Izuku asked, confused and thrown off balance by his new classmate's manner of speaking. And being approached at all. Tokoyami nodded solemnly, glad that he'd been understood. Too often was it that those he spoke to looked back at him as if he spoke madness. It was refreshing to be acknowledged. I am, the raven-headed teen confirmed. Although now I find myself ever the more curious. Is Tai the corpse's true name, or is it something you provided when you took control? Hearing him speak further, it was clear to Izuku that Tokoyami was being overly dramatic on purpose, though he couldn't be sure if it was how the teen normally spoke or was the result of a lonely, scholastic life. If it were the latter, then he'd at least met a kindred spirit. Well, yes, her true name was Izute, Izuku replied, eyes filling with sadness. As for control, she's an extension of my quirk now. Honestly, I wish I could have saved her instead. Saved? Tokoyami breathed, unable to contain his surprise. Realizing what he'd said, he shook his head. No, think not of answering further. Truly, it must have been a most painful experience. The raven-headed teen had no idea just how appreciative his green-haired counterpart was for being allowed to avoid reliving the traumatic events that had ended with the existence of the undead girl for a little longer. As the class necromancer and local edgelord continued their talk in quieter tones, Bakugo sat by himself, working himself even farther into his scorching rage. The apprehension tests had been a hard blow for him. His rightful place at the top taken again and again by smiley extras, people he knew were weaker than him. The freaks' victories over him were the worst though. not even suffered at the hands of combat moves, just cheap tactics unbecoming of a hero. What really boiled his blood was how much attention Romero was getting for his tricks, attention that should have been his for the taking. How could anyone not be disgusted by the mere existence of such a grotesque work? "You two ready?" came the sudden call of Denki Kaminari, a blonde with a happy face. The question visibly startled the so-called dark kids of the group. "We're all leaving to get our things from the classroom now. Some of us are gonna hang out after. Wanna join?" Touched that he was being offered an opportunity he'd never been given by a classmate before, Izuku nevertheless had to deny the invitation. "Maybe next time," the green-haired teen said, "need to feed Tae-chan first before heading out." Even spoken so nonchalantly, the declaration still managed to regain the attention of the rest of the boys. "Would it be an imposition if I stayed to observe?" Tokoyami asked, fully expecting his plea to be rejected. "I find my curiosity still itching to be sated. What does a corpse require as sustenance? What rituals need be involved?" Unnoticed by the rest of the boys, a now pale Bakugo quickened his pace, throwing his dirty clothes haphazardly into his bag. The blonde knew what was involved in feeding that abomination, and he knew he didn't want to be anywhere near the freak when it happened. I mean, I don't mind." "But are you sure?" Izuku asked, wary of exposing and potentially losing his weird and barely understandable friend to the sight of Tae's feeding. "I don't know if you'd be able to stomach it." Tokoyami, far from being off-put by the green-haired teen's reservations, gave a firm nod in affirmation. Dark Shadow, the symbiotic quirk entity that lived inside of the raven-headed teen, poked its head out and gave a thumbs up as well. Reassured, Izuku gave the two a bright smile, and the two went to exit the locker room. Crossing the threshold back into UA proper, the two boys were immediately joined by Tae, who oddly enough seemed to give off a vibe of impatience to return to Izuku's side. After a short walk back to their classroom, the two realized the rest of Class 1A had already left to pursue their own devices. Now alone, Tokoyami started when he noticed the green-haired teen pull out a penknife from his pocket. "For what purpose is there to draw a blade?" the raven-headed teen asked in mild alarm. While his trust in his classmate, and hopefully new friend, was sizable, his overactive imagination was quickly getting the better of him. It was with an ever more quickly beating heart he noticed the presence of the undead beside him. Though surely Izuku wasn't dark enough to commit murder for food? Tokoyami could only watch in fascinated horror as the green-haired teen he just met raised the knife to his own arm and positioned the blade to stab. "Tae-chan feeds best from fresh sources," Izuku said sweetly, an affectionate smile on his face that appeared more twisted with each passing second. "And you know, you can't get any fresher than the living. Now please, try not to scream." Izuku hated playing on the raven-headed teen's exaggerated sense of drama, but the truth of his blood wasn't something he was comfortable with sharing just yet. Better that his classmates thought that Tae could survive off of any living thing, instead of just him. Unbeknownst to the two boys, Momo and Tsuo had been delayed in leaving the girls' locker room, waylaid due to searching for the taller girl's lost student ID card. They also didn't notice as the girls watched Izuku plunge the tiny blade downward, carved into his own flesh to draw as much blood as possible, and did it all without any outward care for Tokoyami's contorting face. Gods! The blood! The pain! The raven-headed teen nearly shouted. How can you withstand such agony? Unperturbed at this point, Izuku removed the penknife from his hand and cleaned the blade against its back, the only part not covered in blood. "This pain is nothing compared to letting Tae-chan starve," Izuku replied, actively avoiding the real question. "You really don't want to see her get that bad?" When enough of the crimson liquid had pooled in his wounded palm, the green-haired teen raised the limb to Tae's face. The zombie girl eagerly leaned forward, beginning to lick away the blood with deft tongue strokes. It was then that the two boys heard the unmistakable sound of dry heaving. Concerned, they rushed toward the source around the corner, Tay gently taking Izuku's hand to continue her meal. "Kero?" croaked Tsu, her worry carrying through when the boys found her. The green-haired teen was quick to notice that the frog girl's wide eyes were staring intently at his bleeding hand. "Don't worry, it doesn't even hurt anymore." Using his non-damaged hand, Izuku waved away the concern emanating from his classmates, downplaying the gruesome scene the best option. "And look, it's already closing. It won't even leave a scar." The green-haired teen's reassurance did nothing to alleviate the fact that the disturbing sounds of a tongue lapping up blood continued to echo through the hallway. "You don't have to do that every day, do you, Kero?" Tsu asked, still oozing worry. The distress confused Izuku, who was unused to such regard. "Of course not," the green-haired teen assured, hoping to bring peace to his new friend and the cute girl that for some reason was showing care for his well-being. "Once a week is usually enough, if there's continuous activity. Although she does need emergency feeding if something drastic happens that requires regeneration." As he finished speaking, Izuku's self-inflicted wound finished closing. Meal complete, Tay dropped the green-haired teen's hand and returned to standing behind him. Seeing this, the three teens stood awkwardly, unsure how to continue. Anyway, what brought you back here?" Izuku asked hesitantly, desperate to get out of the uncomfortable silence. His question did the job, and the short girl stiffened, no doubt remembering what had led her to the scene in the first place. "Ah. That's because Momo here forgot, eh?" "Momo? Kero?" Tsu's explanation died as she pointed to her side, only to notice that she was pointing at empty air. It took only moments to decipher that the mature girl had fled the scene, unable to find a private enough place to empty her stomach. Izuku should have known, for all the acceptance he'd found so far, there'd still be some who reacted negatively to glimpses of his quirk-strewn nature. But for now, life hadn't turned out as bad as he'd expected. 1A classroom, day of battle trial. Sitting at his desk, Izuku lightly reminisced over the last few days. He'd been continuously surprised by how much kinder the school in general was to him than his past schools had been. For once, people didn't outright run away from him, though admittedly a few shied away and kept their distance. And so far no one had openly refused to partner up with him during classes, although Momo still made an effort to find an alternative before giving in, and Bakugo hadn't been given a chance to be an exception to this rule yet. Teachers didn't seem to care about Tay or her antics, only asking once each whether she was infectious or not, or if he was keeping her well fed. The pro-heroes didn't flinch at the occasional groan or grunt either, rather they acted as if nothing had happened at all. The best part of this tolerance was that half of them didn't even seem to mind when the zombie girl knelt to lay her head on his lap while he did his work. That wasn't to say that Ida and Mineta didn't voice their discomfort at such scenes though. Tokoyami had continued to be a source of surprise for him too, he was glad to say. The raven-headed boy made it a point to engage in casual conversation with him on a daily basis, although he still struggled to understand his new friend's obsession with darkness and the occult. Yes, all in all Izuku found that classes at UA were more than pleasant to attend. But, today turned out to be the one he'd been both looking forward to and dreading in equal measure. And it all started in the afternoon when the first teacher to enter the classroom wasn't Aizawa as they'd expected, but I'm coming through the door like a normal person. All Might. Wearing his Silver Age costume, the number one hero posed magnificently as he entered the room in no way like a normal person. All smiles, the symbol of peace dropped his bomb-worthy news on 1A. Today you'll have your first taste of heroism. All Might boomed, smile widening. And to do that you'll first need these. Pressing a concealed button, the muscular hero revealed hidden compartments in one of the walls numbered from 1 to 20. The slots popped open, each revealing the respectively numbered case. Heroes need costumes, not the least of reasons being so that they can become symbols in their own right, All Might announced, gaining excited shouts from his students as they realized what they were being given. So go. Change and meet me at today's designated training ground. Just as quickly as he'd arrived, the number one hero darted away, gone in the blink of an eye. In seconds the members of 1A had descended on the wall of cases. It wasn't a shocker his classmates would be so exuberant, Izuku decided. They'd all designed their own costumes before submitting them along with their applications, so everyone was eager to see their visions brought to life. Unfortunately, the green-haired teen knew he didn't have as much to cheer over as the others. UA, as great as it was, like all other hero schools, was governmentally mandated to contract outside agencies to actually produce their students' first costumes. This was ostensibly to make sure that no incoming newbie snuck in an unfair or dangerous advantage in their gear. The issue with this was that these agencies were allowed to hold their own standards when producing these costumes. And it was just Izuku's luck that regenerators, designated more often than not as mutant types, weren't held in high regard by support agencies. These factors led to almost guarantee that his costume would be made by one of the cheaper companies, not that he minded too much. If it came down to it, he'd just contract one of the support course students when he could and upgrade his gear. As for right now, there wasn't anything for it. UA campus, ground beta. Feeling exposed, Izuku gazed at the various costumes his classmates had appeared in. All of them were flashy or showed off the physical rewards of their hard work. It was almost too difficult to look at the girls for this very reason, their strength and beauty glowing like the sun. And then there was him, who looked fucking Romero. This is a hero school, not a goddamn horror movie, Bakugo spat, incredibly quick to throw a jab. Unlike the blonde's previous attempts to put down the green-haired teen, this time there were a few snorts from their classmates. What made you think dressing like a fucking tax collector was a good idea? If one were ignorant, like the explosive blonde, it would be easy to see why Izuku's hero costume appeared less than impressive at first glance. The suit consisted of dark green dress pants with a matching vest and tie, contrasted sharply by a crimson-red dress shirt underneath. The black dress shoes weren't anything to call home about either. But this was in appearance only. Izuku had designed the entire suit to be made of a specific type of ballistic weave so that even if he ended up with the cheapest of support agencies, if they followed his specs to the letter, then it'd be incredibly hard for the material to be punctured or cut by normal means or strength. His plain dress shoes also held secrets. He'd requested steel toes and ankle protectors be inserted into them, the metal guards no doubt going to pack a painful punch in the event of a pinch. The only cosmetic add-ons he'd sprung for, unlike certain other classmates who'd overindulged, were the fingerless gloves that covered his hands and the round sunglasses that hid away his eyes. In his opinion, the complete look gave him a slightly more mature and professional look. "I can't believe you, Midoriya," Mineta nearly cried, eyeing Tei with an overly dramatic tearful look. "You squandered such potential. Why did you dress her like that?" And now everyone was staring at Tei. The zombie girl's hero costume could be described as militaristic, at best. The overall jumpsuit was patterned in green camouflage while brown combat boots and gloves adorning her hands and feet. Reinforced elbow and knee pads, both kept joints protected and allowed for devastating blows. And that was just the beginning. A black harness complemented the undead girl's developed chest while also housing tools ideal for rescue, a coil of reinforced rope, a collapsible shovel, miniature lanterns, a medkit, and even a crowbar were all tightly secured for optimum movement. The only cosmetic addition was a pair of colored sports shades that covered her eyes, an attempt to conceal an unsettling red gaze from civilians and those others who didn't need any more stress in a rescue scenario. "You know." Some intervened quickly, a gesture that Izuku appreciated to the point of beaming at the frog girl. "He kind of looks like a detective. Doesn't he? Karo." A pair of floating gloves and boots bounced over to the slightly hunched green-haired teen. One of the gloves acted as if it were resting on a chin in thought. "Wouldn't he need a trench coat though?" came the girly voice of Taru Hagakure. Jiro scoffed, drifting over to join the conversation. She made an attempt to rest a hand on Taru's shoulder, missed, and settled on crossing her arms. You know that most real-life detectives don't actually wear trench coats, right? The punk rock girl asked. Before the invisible girl could answer, All Might arrived in a sudden burst of speed, wind, and dust. All right, you zygotes. Here's today's most important lesson. All Might boomed, standing tall and proud, every inch the symbol of peace he was. Where you fight is just as important as who you fight. Why? Because when you use your quirks in public, and you all have quite the powerful quirks, you could easily jeopardize lives if you're not careful. Class 1A stood, devouring the words of wisdom from the number one hero without moving a muscle. There were still some who couldn't believe they'd actually gotten the chance to have the larger-than-life man as their teacher. Statistically speaking, most hero-villain encounters are in enclosed spaces, whether you know it or not: banks, important facilities like hospitals or schools, and even secret lairs. All Might continued, that's why today's training is going to be inside this building here, so that you all may learn to overcome the obstacles that arise from combat in confined spaces. That's right. This is your first battle trial. The respectful silence was suddenly broken by exuberant shouts and exclamations of excitement. Their first combat class. The teens couldn't believe it was finally here. Distracted, the students of 1A missed All Might pulling out a garishly colored box with the word lots written on it. Time is limited, so we'll be drawing lots to see who partners with who. The symbol of peace announced. Then we can go over the details of the trial. Ida abruptly raised his hand, speaking immediately after doing so. Sir, isn't there a better way to choose such important roles? The tall boy asked. Izuku mentally face-palmed, wondering why he bothered to raise his hand if he was going to speak anyway before being called on. He stepped closer to his uptight classmate. Think about it like this, the green-haired teen said, pros oftentimes don't get to choose who they end up working with in a crisis. This kind of simulates that randomosity. Seeing the rationale in Izuku's words, Ida bowed to their teacher with words of apology. All Might waved the remorse away with a smile, putting a hand in the box he held. It's fine, young Ida. Now, let's see who the first team is. The number one hero dug around before withdrawing two slips with names written on them. Tsasui. You'll be partnered with Izuku Midoriya. Gnuh. Ante. The tentative laughter in response to the zombie girl's almost offended-sounding groan was enough to almost cover Izuku's sigh of relief at not being paired with Bakugo. The only one to notice was his new partner, Su, who found the green-haired teen fun to watch. After that, pairs were created, quickly, and before long all of 1A was partnered up and ready to go. From somewhere unseen by his students, All Might pulled a second box. This one just as garishly colored as the first, with H and V printed on it. Now let's see who our first hero and villain teams are. All Might shouted to the cheers of his students. The pro hero drew from the new box. Bakugo and Ida will be on the hero team. It was at that moment that Izuku felt the ice-cold grip of cosmic irony curl around his heart. There was no way. All Might drew a second card. It would just be his luck if, while Asui and Midoriya will be on the villain team. The declaration was received with cursing from Izuku and a disappointed croak from Tsu, neither wanting to be villainous in their first training exercise. Bakugo sniggered loudly, only adding fuel to the fire. The look in the blonde's eyes couldn't be mistaken for heroic in the slightest. Minutes later, second floor of the training building. The exercise hadn't turned out to be too difficult, all things considered. The villain teams would be given a fake nuclear weapon to protect until a timer ran out, and the hero teams had to either secure said weapon by touching it or capture both of their opponents. The villain teams would be given a surprisingly large amount of time to prepare, while the hero teams had to wait outside and then go in totally unprepared, All Might justifying this by reminding his students that real villains hardly ever played fair. Which really amounted to nothing in the end, as neither Izuku nor Tsu really wanted to be villains, and the duo decided to leave their fake weapon on the second floor as a result. They both agreed to be done with the exercise as soon as possible. Villains? We don't look like villains, Izuku groused, railing against their unlucky draw. And Bakugo sure as salt doesn't act like a hero. It was a lose-lose situation for the two green-haired teens. If they won, then their reputation would be tarnished for being too good at acting villainously, but if they lost, then they'll lost. Ida at least looks the part, Karo offered, joining her partner's rant. Even while doing so, the frog girl seemed more intent on calming Izuku down than adding her own complaints. The green-haired teen knew in a straight fight his only chance against opponents like these two, who'd been born with amazing quirks fit for heroes and the drive to reach said title, would have been to turn them against one another. He was even confident he could easily achieve such an outcome, but concern over his partner's reputation in the face of such tactics kept him from bringing this fact up. Yeah. You're right, Izuku said, turning toward the frog-themed girl. Was it just him, or did she look even more attractive while crouched down like that? I'm sorry you had to see me complaining like that, Asui-san. Call me Tsu-chan, Suba answered suddenly. Izuku nearly fell over. The green-haired teen attempted to collect himself before staring at the frog girl in disbelief. With her naturally expressionless face, it was hard to read her intentions, but looking into her black eyes made it clear beyond all doubt that she was being honest. What? Izuku stuttered, his mind crashing to a halt. Tsu-chan? As if we were friends? The idea that a girl, a pretty girl at that, wanted to be friends with someone like him of all people was completely absurd. There's no way the request had been real. Karo. Tsu croaked while giving a cute note in response. The frog girl didn't smile, but inside it felt good. She'd already taken a step toward her self-imposed goal of making many new friends at her new school. Izuku shook himself free from his stupor, a guarded expression suddenly appearing in his eyes. Does that include Tae-chan? He asked, already knowing such a demand would most likely end in the retraction of the offer of friendship. Tsu merely shrugged, glanced at the zombie girl, and stuck her tongue out in thought. Sure, why not? Karo, came the frog girl's simple and honest reply. As if to prove her acceptance, the heroine in training approached Tae without concern, poking her in the cheek like a curious child. Tsu was never one to judge a quirk by its appearance, knowing from experience that some weren't pretty to look at and others were downright terrifying. People with quirks like those usually ended up lonely, like her dear friend from middle school, and she knew they were the ones in dire need of real friendship. So, then, would it be too much to ask? And you don't have to if you don't want to. But, could you call me Izuku-kun? The words, calling up a nickname from long ago, were forced past a throat choked between fear and hope. Izuku hadn't been called such since kindergarten, when a girl he shared a bento with had giggled it at him. Bakugo had kicked her the next day. And he hadn't stopped until she tearfully promised to never talk to the little green freak ever again. Sure, I don't see a problem with that. Why are you crying, Izuku-kun? Karo. Tsu hadn't seen the problem with such a silly request. Izuku-kun? She probably would have come up with the nickname herself in a day or two. But then her new friend had burst into tears. I'm just so happy, Izuku confessed through hiccuping sobs. It's silly. I know. But I'm just so happy that you're my friend. The green-haired teen tried to wipe away the waterworks, but to little result. At least it was enough to earn a cute smile from the frog girl who just changed his life. That smile, which had slipped by Tsu's normal mask of reservation, came from her understanding of the need for such a pure offering of friendship. GGGGHH. The sudden groan from Tae, suspiciously sounding like a warning, caught the frog girl off guard. The hard look that cut through her new friend's tears did so even more. You're right, Tae-chan, Izuku replied, finally, succeeding in wiping away his tears. And then whatever else the green-haired teen said was lost to a storm of muttering, Words spoken too fast and low for Tsu to follow. Straining her ears, she could at least make out what sounded like she'd been put in danger. Somehow. But that wasn't what worried the frog girl the most regarding what had just happened though. Izuku, did she really just say something you could understand? Karo, Tsu asked. Normally she wouldn't bother, chalking it up to the unpredictability of quirks, but this was different. She'd seen enough zombie movies to know that the undead weren't meant to be intelligent. At least, not enough to be able to communicate with living people. Tsu's intense stare was met with one of Izuku's own, but as the seconds drew on she didn't find it creepy at all. In fact, the frog girl noticed her new friend seemed to actually be more worried for her than anything else. Izuku knew what he had to do as he gazed into Tsu's eyes. He had to keep Bakugo as far away from her as possible. This exercise had just taken on a new difficulty. The blonde would be able to hurt her, and he would, repeatedly, until he drove the frog girl away from him. He wasn't about to lose a friend, not again, and certainly not to Bakugo. Say, Tsu-chan? Izuku asked out of the blue, what would you say about playing to win instead of just giving up? The eyes she stared into spoke to Tsu of not one plan, but hundreds. The grin pulling at her partner's face for some inexplicable reason made her stomach tighten. Karo? The questioning croak only fueled Izuku's determination. This girl was too cute to allow harm to come her way. Even if she was probably fit enough to kick his, or anyone else's, ass easily. Gently, the green-haired teen took the frog girl's hands, hoping she wouldn't hate him for the bold move. I know how to win, but it could get us labeled as villainous for a while. Izuku's words seemed ominous, but they'd piqued Tsu's curiosity. Especially when her partner instantly followed up with, but we don't have to do it unless you're okay with it. So, after a moment of thought, the frog girl decided to give in to a little competitiveness. It would do those hero wannabes good to work for their win. They needed the practice after all. Okay, I'm in Izuku, Tsu said, nodding to show her agreement. But how are you proposing we do this? Do you know their weaknesses? It was all well and good to desire to win, but everyone knew that without a plan even the greatest could be defeated. After all, a tactical mind could topple even the strongest quirks if properly incentivized. Oh, I'm not going to use their weaknesses, Izuku corrected, I'll be playing to their strengths. The green-haired teen undid his tie, drawing a menacing groan from the zombie girl behind him. In that moment, Tsu appeared so much more than a puppet made from dead meat. We're going to get creative. Izuku's final words would plague Tsu's dreams for many years to come. But not in the form of nightmares. Chapter 5 A Sinister Success. Tenya Ida found himself, in a word, concerned. His partner, while not his first choice, had proven himself to be quite strong and intelligent, but that wasn't the source of his apprehension. Bakugo pacing back and forth before the entrance to their test building like a caged animal, palms already popping with small explosions and a snarl twisting his face did. The tall, bespectacled teen didn't know how to calm the blonde down either. He couldn't see any reason for such obvious hostility. It was clear to him, however, that Bakugo had no qualms about not holding back against their opponents, which was also alarming. The two green-themed teens may have proven themselves worthy of their places in the hero course without a doubt, but they couldn't possibly pose too much of a threat against them with the quirks and combat capabilities they held. Can you please calm down? Ida asked, again, for the fifth time. Even equipped in his hero costume as he was, which most agreed gave him a futuristic knight appearance, his displeasure at his partner's behavior was unmistakable. Without missing a beat, or looking away from what he was glaring at, Bakugo shoved a gloved hand in Ida's direction, middle finger raised skyward. Shut the fuck up, stupid, Four Eyes. The blonde shouted, still glaring at the test building. The glower only paused when the explosive teen took a moment to check the numerous belts and clippings of his hero costume. Special attention was paid to the two grenade-shaped arm guards he wore. Ida sighed, once again deciding to ignore the offensive and vulgar gestures and language of his partner. This time, he merely pinched the bridge of his nose under his helmet in exasperation. "What has you so restless?" Ida asked now, hoping that a chance to unload his frustrations would allow the pacing blonde to cool off slightly. "Are you troubled by our opponents? Their quirks? Do you think?" A sudden thought stopped Ida cold, one he hadn't considered before. While it was true that most mutant-type quirk users faced the wrath of society's quirk hierarchy to one degree or another, his family was a rare and special case. Since their mutation only caused minute changes to their physicality, namely wherever their particular variety of engine's exhaust pipes appeared, they was easily hidden. Out of sight, out of mind as it were. As his family had gained prominence over the years, less and less attention was brought to their hereditary quirk's nature and more was placed on its power. Today, he couldn't think of a single person who'd ever looked at Anita and disparaged them based on quirk alone. But what if Bakugo was being so negatively affected by a more obvious mutation? Do you find Asui-san dangerous?" Ida asked hesitantly, hoping his partner wasn't about to be revealed as a quirkist. The question, at least, got a long-awaited answer from the angry blonde. "Ugly frog face. Dangerous." Bakugo threw back, turning to face the extra that had the honor of being his partner. "Don't make me laugh. That malformed thing doesn't even register on my radar. I bet money a small explosion to the face would be all it would take to put it down." Ida reared back from the blonde's deranged, psychopathic words, more worried now than ever. This was worse than just a quirkish mindset. "What is wrong with, how can you even?" Ida couldn't even fully form his emphatic reprimand, his temper had caught so quickly. Before the speedster could attempt to collect himself, a sharp buzzing of an alarm signaled the start of the exercise. "Boo UA faculty office." For the third day in a row, Aizawa sat at his second desk and gave the files of two of his students a once-over. It had turned out his hunch had been right. Katsuki Bakugo and Izuku Midoriya had been classmates since kindergarten all the way through middle school. What had caused the normally unflappable man to need 2 nights of breathers in between researching this discovery was the accompanying lack of data regarding any interaction between the two. It was abnormal, to say the least. Bakugo's record was full of surprisingly high grades, not at all the record of the brainless delinquent his temper portrayed him as. And he'd not been able to find a single mark against the kid, which was more than a little suspicious given the blonde's attitude. There was no way the bomber hadn't gotten into, at the very least, a few fights over the years. Midoriya, on the other hand, didn't seem to have gone a handful of days without suffering beatings. Beatings, the gruff teacher had noted. Administrators in all 3 schools, especially the middle school, had downplayed to the point that a culprit had never even been investigated. The infuriating reason for such oversight. A single line, repeated over and over again. No evidence of lasting harm. That both teens had walked away from governmentally mandated scholastic psych evaluations with spotless all clears was. Such a load of bullshit, Aizawa muttered to the otherwise empty room. Taking a second to shake away his rising frustrations at the obvious manipulations of glory-seeking institutions, the brusque teacher decided to take a chance and see how severe the situation might actually be. Using a special search engine designed by some of Island's finest, the Pro Hero input Aldra Junior High. Immediately, multiple flags were raised. It looked like this wasn't the first time the middle school had looked the other way for students they felt showed promise. Aizawa almost did a double take, almost, when he read that one such rising star had been expelled from Shiketsu a couple of years back for the attempted rape of a classmate. "That's it. I'm demanding this school be blacklisted from our acceptance roll," Aizawa grumbled, standing. Seeing the time on the office's clock, he stopped before hastily grabbing his phone. "I need to warn All Might. We need to separate those two before it's too late." Aizawa power walked out of the faculty room and down the hall while the phone rang, hoping that his muscular idiot of a co-worker hadn't done something stupid like pitted the blonde and Verdana against each other. Or, God forbid, he could have put them on the same team. It's true he didn't have the whole picture yet, some might even label his next actions as paranoid, but as he picked up his pace the pro-hero knew in his gut he had enough evidence to warrant his behavior. There was little doubt in his mind that Bakugo had been the one to bully Midoriya. Administrators had tampered with or outright neglected to file reports, and it was probably all in the hopes of gaining renown by having the explosive blonde attend you. Why Midoriya was the victim was still a mystery. As was why the green-haired teen had never fought back. But Aizawa swore on his melatonin he'd find out. Ground Beta, Test Building. The hero team of Bakugo and Ida reached the last unsearched room of the first floor in a state of increasing annoyance. There had not been a single clue of their opponent's whereabouts to be found yet, and while one knew that gathering information before striking was the smart thing to do, the other couldn't care less about anything else other than finding his target and unleashing hell. Making their way to the stairs in hopes of better luck on the next floor, Bakugo decided he'd had enough. Romero. Where the fuck are you? The blonde's scream reverberated through the empty building so strongly that Ida cringed away not only from the lack of subtlety but also the sudden ringing in his ears. The bespectacled teen was about to chastise his degenerate of a partner, again, for his choice of language when the unthinkable occurred. "I'm right here, Kaken," came Izuku's voice from the top of the stairs. Snapping their heads up, the hero team saw the regenerator standing on the landing, just looking down at them. Ida would swear from that day forward that the temperature dropped 20 degrees Celsius after that strange name was thrown out. He would never believe that it was once a term of endearment and not an insult of some kind. Fucking Romero. What did I say about calling me that? Bakugo growled in a dangerously low voice, his right hand open and dripping with sweat from running all over the first floor. Instead of answering, the green-haired teen simply laughed before darting upstairs. Unprepared for such an action, it took a second for the blonde to process what had just happened. And when he did, "Come back here so I can kill you," Bakugo screamed bloody murder as he ran up the stairs, chasing his nemesis as if nothing else mattered. Ida moved to follow, but as soon as he reached the second floor himself, he noticed something peculiar. Shoe prints, marked with yellow paint, tracked from down one of the hallways to up the stairs where Midoriya had gone. A trail? Ida muttered, peering down the paint-covered hall. Originating from this floor? It couldn't be as simple as it appeared, could it? Although, logically speaking, it would be in the villain team's best interest. "I see," Ida said to himself, nodding once. Midoriya's acting as a decoy. It's too bad he didn't notice the paint. Decision made, Bakugo could handle himself after all. The bespectacled teen followed the trail of paint until he reached the central hallway at the end of the corridor. On the floor, with shoe prints splattering out of it, spread an innocent puddle of yellow paint in front of a door at the other end of the hall. It looked as if Midoriya had been in a rush and stepped into it accidentally. "So that was your plan? Guide us upstairs while hiding the bomb close to the entrance where we'd never think to look?" Ida thought out loud. I suppose they didn't have too much time to make anything more elaborate. Knowing he had to be close to his goal, the bespectacled teen continued down the main hall, keeping an eye out for the frog girl. While she was most likely waiting on the other side of the door, there was always the chance of an ambush. He'd need to be careful regardless. Her legs were no doubt incredibly powerful, and the probability of her having enhanced reflexes meant that if he didn't capitalize on his entrance she'd have no trouble both evading him and keeping the bomb secure. Ida really didn't want to chance such a thing. If he took too much time capturing the bomb, and Asui if it came to it, then he wouldn't be able to cut the fight between Katsuki and Midoriya short before the blonde took his violence too far. As he walked and thought, the bespectacled teen felt his footstep in something. Before he could react, a pallet of paint cans fell on him. "Gah!" Ida screamed, his visor becoming completely obscured. Throwing his arms out, The hero in training wasn't sure if he was trying to keep his balance or fend off any potential attackers. When wiping at the paint failed to work, Ida realized he would have to take the whole helmet off if he wanted to regain his bearings. In his mind, the bespectacled teen cursed his lack of attention to his environment as he did so. Of course there'd be at least one trap. Ida spat in anger, taking a moment to examine his ruined piece of armor. It looked ridiculous, covered in so many brilliant colors. Calling it garish was literally an understatement. What was worse, the rest of his costume was the same. And the cherry on top. She knows I'm here. Ida realized, sensibly concluding that the trap was more of an alarm than an attempt at waylaying him. Accepting that the element of surprise was now completely gone, Ida continued his trek without ceremony or care. He hoped that Asui wouldn't laugh at his sorry state when he confronted her, appearing more an unsightly sidekick bumbling out of a mishap than a valiant hero coming to the rescue. Reaching the door with the puddle, the bespectacled teen opened it, expecting the worst. Instead, he was greeted with the sight of Asui watching him curiously while crouched down in front of the fake bomb. It was obvious to him from the frog girl's intense stare that she was ready to make her stand at any moment. Ida gulped, truly believing if he took his eyes off his opponent it would prove fatal. "I didn't expect our warning system to fall on you, Karo," Tsa said, a finger raised to her mouth in thought. "Did it hurt?" The words may have appeared charitable, but never once did Asui lose track of any move Ida made. The bespectacled teen actually felt like it was more an attempt to distract him with friendly banter than anything, something his brother had warned him about. "It took me by surprise, yes," Ida answered, making a circuit around the room under Asui's watchful eye. "But it won't affect my combat capabilities." Completing his canvassing, Ida took notice of all of the boxes and tools that had been scattered around. No matter how he tried to position himself, he couldn't find a path that he could use to maximize his acceleration. "Why didn't you follow your partner?" Asui asked. "He might already be down and captured without your help, Karo." Considering the comment to be a classic attempt at lowering morale, Ida merely shook his head in response. He ignored the twinge of doubt that tried to rise up at the frog girl's words. "Unlikely," Ida countered. "Bakugo is very much a combat-oriented individual. Midoriya is more of a field support type. It's a match in our favor. You should be more worried about yourself, Asui-san." Ida counted the few steps he had before he could achieve victory. First he'd position himself in the best spot possible to make a proper line, one with the least amount of junk in the way. Then, he'd immediately strike with his best move. It'd be too quick for the frog girl to react in time to stop him. It felt like cheating, but the bespectacled teen wasn't about to lose his first hero exercise. Tsa watched in morbid fascination as everything, to the tiniest detail, unfolded just as Izuku had predicted. From Ida falling into the booby trap, to the way he kept his eyes on her the whole time while positioning himself, it was all happening. As her temporary adversary took his final steps into position, the frog girl couldn't help but remember Izuku's plan. Ida's a good guy, that much is obvious, so it stands to reason he'll attempt to retrieve the weapon instead of fighting to avoid hurting you, Izuku had said. That's why we're only going to give him one path to achieve that goal. And once he steps into that perfect position to strike, he'll be finished. She'd been worried the bespectacled teen would notice the real trap they'd be setting for him, but Izuku had calmed that fear easily enough. "Don't worry," he'd said, "he'll never see the trap. Ida suffers from tunnel vision, so he'll only see you and his target." Izuku's prediction had been terrifyingly accurate. Ida hadn't even thought to ask where Te was, and hell, she wasn't even hiding. Even now, as the bespectacled teen took his last step for a perfect line drive charge position, he never noticed the zombie girl standing behind him. AGH. It was all the noise Ida could make as he felt his throat being crushed, his legs spasming as he tried to gain enough traction to relieve the pressure on his windpipe. Ever so stealthily, Tae had managed to come up behind the bespectacled teen and use Izuku's tie as a garrote wire, holding her prey just high enough that the force of his own weight would slowly suffocate him. Then, she raised him higher. "You should probably stop struggling, Ida-san," Karo advised to the hanging teen as she carefully approached. From behind her back, the frog girl pulled out her roll of capture tape. Ida, quickly becoming desperate for air, had resorted to thrashing kicks and elbowing the zombie girl for all he was worth. Unfortunately for him, the attacks had no effect whatsoever. Even as he heard his strikes breaking her ribs, Tae refused to loosen her hold in the slightest. Before long, black spots began to flitter across the bespectacled teen's vision and his strength started to fail. Now despairing, Ida realized his only hope was for Tsuyu to capture him as quickly as possible and hope that would be enough for the zombie girl to release him. The monitoring room. All Might and the rest of 1A observed through the camera feeds as everything they'd seen transpire for the last 10 minutes came to a head. They'd watched as Izuku, Tsuyu, and Tae had moved the boxes and tools from where they'd rested against the back wall to haphazardly around the room. They'd watched as Izuku had jury-rigged a booby trap from paint cans and then purposefully stepped through a puddle of the stuff. Now everything made sense, from the selection of the floor to how Izuku had greeted the hero team. That was evil. Mineta was the first to voice his opinion. Judging by the looks on his classmates' faces, it wasn't as widely shared as he believed it should be. Momo shook her head, stepping forward from the back to see the screens better. "No, it was creative," the mature girl corrected. "Neither Midoriya nor Asui have the appropriate quirks to face a hero team with that kind of power head-on. Resorting to a tactical approach was the right response. If anything, Bakugo and Ida are at fault for believing their opponents would tackle their roles like grunts." The academic recommendation student of 1A hoped her classmates realized the gravity of what they'd just witnessed. Here was proof that being tactical was just as important as being powerful. Still, don't you think they embrace the role of villains a little too much? Masahiro Ojiro, a blond boy with a muscular tail, said while scratching his chin. The teen thanked his ancestors he didn't have to fight such characters. He doubted his martial arts would be too effective against a zombie. It was especially worrisome because this one wasn't the slow monster depicted in some media. "Know thy enemy and know thyself, then you shall not fear the outcome of 1,000 battles," Tokoyami quoted, trying to defend his friend. By perceiving the inner machinations of a villain, a hero's labor is made easier. We should all endeavor to learn by this example. Jiro, more focused on the monitors than the conversation behind her, leaned closer to the screen. The punk rock girl frowned at what she was seeing. "So, why did Midoriya stop there?" Jiro asked, pointing at the digital display in sarcastic confusion. The screen in question showed the main hall of the test building's 5th floor. Izuku was hidden behind one of the support pillars while Bakugo remained in a connecting hallway, about to enter the chamber. Noticing that another battle was most likely about to occur, everyone's focus turned back to the monitors. All Might readied himself to call a stop to the exercise if either student allowed things to get out of control. Main hall of the 5th floor. Bakugo kicked the door before him open, the full force of his rage nearly ripping it from its hinges, and stepped into the chamber with all the manner of a beast drunk on bloodlust. He was going to make that damnable nerd pay, for never knowing his place, for daring to use that fucking cutesy nickname, for destroying his dream of being the only one from Aldra to make it to a, and for beating his scores on the apprehension test with cheap tricks instead of physical talent. Today was the day that Goody Two-Shoes felt the full brunt of being his prey. "You done running?" Bakugo shouted, raising his hands in preparation. He'd end this farce of a match in one blow. Fucking Romero. The explosive blonde looked at the floor, cursing when he saw it was covered in yellow shoe prints going in every direction. The damn nerd was still playing with him. Running? From what? Izuku's questioning voice resonated throughout the hall, making it even harder to pinpoint his location. "No, I've just been waiting for you to get here." But speaking of running, you on the other hand seem a bit winded. Did only a couple of stairs tire you out? Kaken? Barely able to see through the red filling his vision, Bakugo twisted around, searching for a hint of the Verdanet's location. His boiling blood only caused him to breathe harder, turn faster as no clue emerged. Shut the fuck up with that name. The blonde thundered, small explosions popping like firecrackers in his hands. So you're hiding now? You fucking coward. Bakugo, seeing his search tactic was fruitless, attempted to slow his breathing, listening carefully for even a whisper of movement. If that abomination the nerd kept as a pet was in here, then there's no way it'd be able to stay quiet for long. For a few seconds, there was no answer, but then a rustling sound so faint most would miss it came from his right. It was all the information the blonde needed. Doesn't matter, Bakugo boasted, subtly preparing to strike. Now that you're trapped in here with me, your only option is to take your punishment like the obedient little shit you're supposed to be. And I promise, it won't be quick. The blonde's voice became ever more sadistic as he delivered his threat. He could feel his adrenaline searing its way through him at the prospect of finally being able to go all out on someone who deserved it. This would be a lesson for all the other extras of what happened when you didn't stay out of his way. That's where you're wrong. Kaken, Izuku's rebuff sounded from right behind the pillar that Bakugo had been stalking. Deciding to take his chance, the blonde leapt forward to make his first shot a surprise attack. Die! Bakugo roared, firing off a large explosion. Waving the resulting smoke away hurriedly, it was revealed. He'd hit only empty air. You're the one trapped in here with me, Izuku's finished, his voice coming from just behind Bakugo. Out of sheer instinct, the blonde rolled forward, a whooshing sound whipping by his head. The sound of glass shattering followed immediately afterwards. Bakugo realized if he hadn't reacted in time, a bottle would have just smashed his head. And still, there was no sign of the nerd, only the remains of the broken bottle on the floor. Fucking bastard! Bakugo muttered loudly. He kept his eyes jumping from pillar to pillar, the little shit had to be behind one of them. A soft chuckle echoed around the hall, but there was little humor in it. Already on edge? Izuku's disembodied voice called out, "Who's the coward now?" The taunt hit a nerve, Bakugo growling in anger and, not that he'd ever admit it, even to himself, slight despair. He was too leery of his prey's actions to blindly charge in again, however. Even one as great as he would succumb to a well-placed strike to the back of the head. "Are you growling?" Izuku asked, still phantasmal. "Am I dealing with a dog now?" While mocking his childhood tormentor, Izuku was busy readying his plan B, since plan A had failed. He was kind of disconcerted how easy it was to make impromptu knuckle dusters from discarded wire though. The metal actually made the weapon quite the danger, as it would not only increase the solidity of his punches, but also cut due to the mismatched overlapping filaments. Now he just had to be ready to withstand a beating until the timer sounded. "Just fucking die!" Bakugo screamed, shooting an even larger explosion at the pillar in front of him. He didn't know if the nerd was behind it, but if he kept turning the supports to dust then he'd hit him eventually. Prepared for just such a strategy from his aggressor, Izuku had leapt from his cover the moment before the explosion had started. He avoided the destruction of the pillar by millimeters. Bakugo caught movement from the corner of his eye and watched in disbelief as his prey charged at him while the smoke and ash from his attack still billowed through the air. He didn't have enough to redirect his arm, let alone recharge it with enough sweat to be worth a damn. That left only one option. Switching arms, the blonde discharged all the sweat on his offhand, igniting a weak explosion with poor aim. Izuku easily dodged the sloppy assault, although he knew Bakugo probably expected that. After all, this wouldn't be the first time he'd sidestepped one of the blonde's explosions. "Motherfucker!" Bakugo raged, switching arms again to discharge a small explosion toward the approaching Verdanet's abdomen with his already tired hand. Unlike before, Izuku didn't avoid this blast. This time, The green-haired teen pushed through the searing pain and threw a right hook with as much power as he could muster into Bakugo's temple. The strike stunned the blonde, sending him to the ground slightly disoriented. Unbeknownst to the two combatants, in the monitoring room, every one of their classmates had winced upon witnessing that last brutal exchange. Most worried about Izuku's well-being, that explosion had been at point-blank range. That worry then became horror as they watched the green-haired teen stumble out of the fading smoke, clothes destroyed, with a large chunk of his abdomen turned to charred flesh. All Might even moved to call off the exercise before staring in stricken fascination as the blackened flesh quickly reverted to its original healthy state. The only remaining evidence an attack had even landed was the boy's torn and burned clothes. "You're going to need to try a lot harder if you want to take me down, you know," Izuku said as he walked toward his downed opponent, an opponent that was struggling to stand. The green-haired teen was glad his pain tolerance was so high nowadays. That explosion to the gut had hurt a lot, but he'd been prepared for it from the beginning. Knowing each injury he took here was an injury his newest friend wouldn't have to suffer made it easier to take as well. "Go to hell." Bakugo slurred, his head still ringing. Taking a gamble, the blonde rolled and leapt toward the nerd that thought he was something special, aiming to surprise the little shit with his own well-practiced right swing. Izuku quickly stepped into the surprise attack, caught the offending arm, and, applying a textbook judo throw, sent Bakugo back to the floor with force. While completing the counter, the green-haired teen smoothly added a well-placed punch to the blonde's face, breaking his nose. Bakugo rolled to the side in an attempt to avoid further injury, his face in agony and his brain unable to properly focus. The worst injury, however, was that his nemesis stood there fresh as lettuce and showed not a single sign of being hurt. Watching with questioning eyes as the explosive blonde staggered, while trying to stand, Izuku wondered why so little was affecting someone as violent as Bakugo so much. The only thing different from any other day was that he wasn't holding back. The two punches the green-haired teen had thrown, while enhanced by his improvised knuckle dusters, were also thrown with absolute disregard for self-preservation. They felt normal to him, but they carried so much more force than a normal punch would have. Which probably explained the pain in his fingers and wrists that was fading away now. Izuku realized something else in that moment. He could pull off Plan C. He could win this fight. "Do yourself a favor, and give up," Izuku taunted his discombobulated opponent. "You just can't win." If there was one thing the green-haired teen knew how to do, it was push Katsuki Bakugo's buttons. And if he really wanted to fully defeat the blonde in this fight, he'd need to completely break him. Otherwise, the explosive teen wouldn't learn anything. Bakugo sneered at the little shit that spoke down to him like an enraged, feral animal. The freak stood there, all tall and proud of himself, with an air of superiority hanging off him. It was unacceptable. Pushing with every bit of his fury, the blonde was able to force himself to stand. Not waiting a second, he set off an explosion, creating a smokescreen to buy a few seconds more time. The explosive teen had hoped his damn arm bracers would have been fully charged by now, but he wasn't about to wait any longer. He was going to defeat the pebble that foolishly thought itself a mountain and show it that it should have stayed in its place by the side of the road. "I'm going to kill you," Bakugo shouted, bringing his hands together. He aimed, fully resolved for the resulting blast to incinerate the nerd to the bone. Much to the blonde's surprise, Izuku had already leapt forward. Throwing a straight, the green-haired teen landed a punch to the face just as his opponent's explosion went off in his own. Both combatants fell. Once again, unbeknownst to the two battling teens, the remaining entirety of 1A was watching from the monitoring room, gasps and screams of horror filling the air at the scene. More than one would beg All Might to stop the fight, a plea the pro hero would have answered if not for the one detail he was quick to point out. Turning his students' attention back to the screen, the concerned classmates bore witness as Izuku rose up, his face nothing but nightmarishly black and flesh and eyes that ran like egg yolks. Then, before their very eyes, The green-haired teen's face began to return to normal, new skin and eyes growing so fast the changes were perceptible. By the time their classmate finished standing back up, he was completely unblemished. "You're getting tired," Izuku stated, walking towards a struggling Bakugo. "You're slower, and your explosions are getting weaker. You're done for. In fact, you lost this fight the moment you left your partner alone." Bakugo was seeing double at this point, and dizzy was an extreme understatement to how he was feeling. The blonde hated to admit it, but the freak's punches hit like a truck. "Fucking Romero. You're beneath me," Bakugo wheezed, able to finally get his feet under him and stand up. Any of the 17 observers in the monitoring room would have said the blonde looked ready to drop with one more well-placed punch. But like a cornered animal, this was his last stand, and he was going to put everything he had into it. Izuku advanced slowly with fists up, like a boxer. Once within arm's reach of the blonde, Bakugo threw a hand out for a close-range explosion. Expecting such reliance on his quirk, the green-haired teen swung his body downward and to the side, avoiding his opponent's attack completely. Seeing the little shit stand tall and undamaged, and ready to throw a punch at him, Bakugo reacted on sheer instinct again and threw out his other hand. He couldn't muster too much sweat, so the resulting explosion was small, but it turned out it wouldn't have mattered anyway. The freak repeated his dodge maneuver, this time to the blonde's opposite side. In that instant, the explosive teen felt something he hadn't truly experienced in a long time. Fear. Watching as Bakugo's eyes broadcasted him entering panic mode, Izuku preformed his evasion tactic again and again, whether there was an explosion or not. Each step gained the green-haired teen a bit of momentum, and the instant he knew the blonde couldn't track him anymore, he launched his punch. Bakugo sensed an incoming attack and allowed his instincts to guide his arms to cover his already injured head. Unfortunately for him, this worked against him, as the target had been his liver. Searing pain the likes of which he'd never experienced before shot through the blonde, forcing his arms down in a reflexive move to guard a vital zone. This gave Izuku the perfect window to rain punch after punch on Bakugo's unprotected head. Left, then right, then left again. He made full use of his body's momentum. Fully prepared to end the fight with a full-force uppercut, the green-haired teen paused as his opponent stumbled back. Slowly, Bakugo sank to his knees. A half-second later, he collapsed forward face-first to the ground. The blonde was still half-conscious, unable to act any further. "How disappointing," Izuku proclaimed in a rather dramatic fashion. "All that bravado, all that hatred, and you couldn't even last a full round." Reaching into his back pocket, the green-haired teen withdrew a small metallic case. It might not have shown, but he was hurting all over, and his stomach demanded sustenance immediately. But Izuku wanted to complete the scene for his longtime tormentor, so he could have a glimpse at the bigger picture. "You're not even worth the effort of capturing," Izuku continued, snapping open the case. "Now, if you don't mind, I need to check on my pretty little partner. Feel free to wait here, for the test to end. Or crawl downstairs if you want a second round. I bet a real hero could do that." From the case, the green-haired teen picked out a small cylindrical object with rounded ends and placed it into his mouth. When it had become apparent that his healing resulted in severe hunger pains, he and his mother had cooked up some homemade candy, mixing in powdered nuts to add a little protein to the concoction. The candies had come out in shapes that reminded them of cigars, and Inko hadn't been able to help but point out how cool he'd look with them in his mouth. That comment had been immediately followed with pleas for him to not start smoking while he was still young. "What a waste of time," Izuku said aloud as he left the room, leaving the semi-conscious Bakugo to seethe on the ground. The original plan C had included capturing the blonde, but the blast to his abdomen had blown his capture tape away. Even so, the green-haired teen doubted the explosive teen would be able to reach Tsa before time ran out, especially since there were multiple stairs in the way. Bakugo, for the time being, couldn't tell up from down, but he knew one thing. He'd just been bested by a Nobody who didn't even have the right to even think of doing so. The blonde felt so humiliated he wanted to disappear. This couldn't be happening. In his mind, he'd seen it all, the freak cowering on the floor in fear of his obvious superiority, the justified beating he'd give, the victory he naturally deserved. The world wouldn't stop spinning, and even if it had, Bakugo was having little success at moving his unresponsive limbs. Then, like a miracle from the shitty gods themselves, his bracers flashed red and hummed. His secret weapon was finally ready to use. Against every screaming nerve in his body, Bakugo hauled himself along the floor, crawling as best he could forward. Overshadowing every agony the blonde felt as he moved was a bone-deep ache for one last shot at his nemesis. Romero was going down. The monitoring room. Did Midoriya just pull off a Dempsey roll? Ijiro Kirishima asked his classmates in surprise. The spiky redhead was amazed that such an old-school move worked in these modern times. Tokoyami merely crossed his arms, a look of understanding on his avian face. There could be little else one should expect from my fellow Master of Darkness, the raven-headed teen said, praising his friend in his own way. That brutish simpleton dared gaze into the abyss, and the void overwhelmed his mortal coil. Beside her overdramatic classmate, Momo was covering her mouth in revulsion at the level of violence she just witnessed. At the same time, the mature teen could understand the tactics demonstrated. Midoriya had fought the smart way, ensuring through his control of the flow of combat that his opponent could never use his quirk to the fullest. Way to go, Midoriya! Jiro praised, punching the air in excitement. It had been too long since the punk rock girl had been so electrified by a fight. Ojiro eyed his celebrating classmate with a frown. The martial artist had to use a bit of his training to keep his tail from twitching in agitation. Should you really be cheering for the villains? The tailed teen asked quietly. As much as he could agree that defeating Bakugo was a good thing, showing support for the bad guys still felt wrong. All Might, smile still in place, didn't like what he'd seen one bit. The level of hatred shown by young Bakugo, the ruthless cunning displayed by young Midoriya. It was just wrong. The pro-hero could sort of understand the green-haired teen's reasoning. He'd heard how worried the boy had been over young Asui getting caught in their explosive crossfire, but to go so far as to humiliate the blonde? It left a bad feeling in the number one hero's gut. Maybe if the symbol of peace had known as Izuku's capture tape had been destroyed he would have thought differently, but as the green-haired teen's communication bead had been ruined by that explosion to the face, he didn't. Sight of the faux weapon. Izuku-kun. What happened? Some immediately asked as Izuku entered the room, his clothes burnt and in tatters. Are you alright? Karo. The green-haired teen smiled reassuringly at his partner, thankful for her concern. He also gave a smile to Tai, who was sitting on a truss-up standing guard. I'm fine. Everything hurts, but I'm fine, Izuku said, coming to stand next to the frog girl. But Bakugo's not coming though. Tsu frowned at this. She couldn't stop staring at her partner's belly. How could it look so unblemished yet the reinforced clothes that were supposed to protect it were a mess? What does that mean? Karo, Tsu asked in concern. Izuku shrugged, gently lowering himself until he was sitting next to the frog girl's side. He waved a hand non-committally through the air. I lost the capture tape, but left him with a concussion, Izuku explained as Tsu began poking his stomach in barely concealed wonder. He's not making it back this far before time runs out. We've won. From his position on the floor, looking like a mummified cocoon due to the amount of capture tape enveloping him, Ida shook his head furiously until his mouth was free. He'd have moved more, but it turned out zombie girl weighed much more than he thought. Impossible. The bespectacled teen exclaimed, how could you have defeated him with such differences in quirks? In an obvious attempt at ignoring their opponent, Tsu narrowed her eyes at the object hanging from her partner's mouth. Do you smoke? The frog girl asked, making Izuku smile. Do you want one? The green-haired teen asked in return, offering up his small case. Realizing after examining the contents that her partner wasn't suggesting she take a cancer stick, but enjoy candy, Sa gladly agreed. She decided a celebratory toast wouldn't kill them. After all, there was only a minute left to wait before they'd win. Through unimaginable pain and suffering, Bakugo had managed to haul himself to the second floor. He'd added to his misery each time he'd rolled down a flight of stairs, but he knew from overhearing Four Eyes that this was where he'd found the bomb. The world might have never stopped spinning, his head might have felt like it was going to explode any minute, and his legs might have refused to hold him even now, but the blonde was too focused on unleashing his secret weapon on the freak to notice or care. That singular purpose was why the explosive teen had crawled his way here through agony, why he'd pushed his body past its limits and stood up so he could lean against the wall for support as he hobbled along, why as he began to hear voices and laughter around the upcoming corner he redoubled his efforts to get into firing range. As the beaten-down blonde turned the corner, just making out the freak's shape through the far-off door, he knew nothing was going to stop him now. The villain team wins. All Might's booming voice filling the test building was the last thing Bakugo wanted to hear. He'd lost, and now nothing could wash away his disgrace. But, as the blonde watched his nemesis from across the distance, how the freak smiled like an idiot to someone or something outside his vision, he came to a decision. Test or no test, he had to erase the cause of his life's only defeat from existence. So, Bakugo readied his bracer, cocking back the large handle, and placed his finger through the pin. Izuku had just given Tai an order to free the still fuming Ida, who looked quite upset over his embarrassing defeat, when a glint through the open doorway caught his eye. Turning, the green-haired teen had only a second to react as he saw a bloodied Bakugo aiming his grenade-like arm guard in his general direction. Using that fraction of time, the verdant hero in training pushed away a startled Sa just as a truly cataclysmic explosion rocked the entire building to its foundation. The detonation was so massive and yield that none of the teenagers in the room could do more than flail around in the face of its might. Two support pillars took direct hits, immediately collapsing into scorched rubble and taking the ceiling and parts of the next two floors with them. Ida, having miraculously stayed conscious during the disaster, took a moment to take stock of his situation after the world stopped shaking. His ears were ringing so hard they hurt, and he could feel a wet sensation running down his face from his forehead. Ignoring what he knew that to be, the bespectacled teen tried to peer through the mountain of wreckage in the room for signs of his classmates. His stomach sank. There was nothing but trouble. That was until he caught sight of the zombie girl desperately trying to dig her way through a huge pile of debris. Madrya. Asui. Ida shouted in horror as he realized what had happened. It was like a horrible tragedy unfolding before him. Thanks to the capture tape still restraining him, the bespectacled teen couldn't join the effort to save his classmates. Two new wet sensations ran down his face now, in stereo. And the speedster couldn't ignore these ones. Bakugo basked in the aftermath of unleashing his secret weapon, drunk on the sight of such destruction, such evidence of his indisputable power. He felt like everything was back on track now, as if he was one step closer to becoming number one now that he'd finally defeated the green-haired shitstain for good. The blonde's moment of glory was short-lived, however, as he was violently cast aside by an incoming mob. Madrya. Tokoyami screamed in distress as he rushed into the room, dark shadow pushing Bakugo to the side without a word so his path would be unimpeded. The raven-haired teen had been the first to dart out of the monitoring room as soon as everyone had realized that the explosive blonde really was going to launch an attack even though the test had ended. He'd been seconded by All Might, although that was only because the pro-hero had spent a precious few seconds calling for Madrya and Asui to answer their mix before running. The rest of the class had followed suit, each as worried for Izuku and Tsu as the other. What the? Bakugo was still unable to process what had just happened when he suddenly felt a powerful hand pin him down. Within seconds, both of his bracers had been stripped from his battered arms. The squeal and crunch of crushing metal followed by 2 lumps of technological slag falling to the floor in front of his face clued the bewildered blonde as to what was happening. All Might knew from years of experience that the first thing to do in situations like this was to neutralize any danger of a second offensive, no matter how much the desire to save lives tugged at the heartstrings. That's why the #1 hero had opted for restraining Bakugo and destroying his weapons before joining the rescue effort 1A had begun. Worse still, he knew he couldn't punch his way out of this, couldn't smash his way to a day saved. That would more than likely cause further harm to come to his buried students. "They're still alive," Jiro exclaimed, having plugged her ear jacks into the mountain of rubble. Using her quirk, the punk rock girl located the pair with ease, directing her classmates to help Tay. Surprisingly, the zombie girl was digging in the right direction. Beneath the wreckage, 2 pillars had collided with the fake bomb, tearing through the papier-mâché with ease, but still allowing enough drag to slow their collapse enough to create a small cavern between them. A single surviving light bulb flickered in the hollow, dangling from sparking wires. The dying light, as pitiful as it was enough for the 2 occupants of the space to take stock of their situation. When she could think again after the chaos of the explosion, Sue examined herself as best she could. One of her arms was broken, if the bone sticking out was any indication, and she couldn't feel her legs. Normally that would have sent the frog girl into a blinding panic, but there was worse news. A large piece of rebar was sticking out of her stomach, and she could clearly see blood leaking out of the wound. Feeling the panic coming now, Sue was distracted by movement to her left. Managing to turn her head just enough, she saw her partner. Izuku was a mess. One of his arms was nothing but char, and a fragment of glass was embedded in his right eye. Rebar had also pierced through the green-haired teen, in multiple places. Remarkably, there was only a small amount of blood around him though. Izu-kun. Sue rasped out, hoping to get her partner's attention. Izuku suddenly moved, reaching for the glass in his eye. He gripped it tight, gave a sharp yank. God. Fucking. Damn it. The green-haired teen screamed, the glass leaving his eye socket without even a spurt of blood. After only a few seconds, and blinks, he opened his eye. The emerald orb was good as new. Unnoticed, the charred limb had returned to normal, unblemished except for the surrounding dust, dirt, and ash smearing on it. Seemingly in a masochistic mood, Izuku then reached behind him and pushed, forcing himself off the rebar that was impaling him. God fucking damn it. This time the curse was hissed through clenched teeth, the metal sliding through him obviously more painful than the hero in training had expected. Nevertheless, in moments he'd managed to free himself, the resulting holes slowly starting to close. Karo? Tsu's call, weak as it had been, was enough to catch Izuku's attention. Seeing the frog girl's state, he quickly stumbled to her side. Taking his partner's hand in his, he gave her a reassuring squeeze before moving to apply pressure on her most grievous wound as best he could. The only thing running through the green-haired teen's mind the entire time was a single thought: this was just like Tay. I'm scared. Tsu gasped through her pain, her words causing her partner to shed tears of despair. Izuku knew that rescue was on its way, but he also knew that Tsu didn't have that kind of time. She was already getting cold and All Might, usually everyone's best bet for salvation, wouldn't be able to use his unbeatable strength to save them before it was too late. 15 minutes to dig us out, at best. 5 to get you out of this spot as safely as possible. The nearest hospital is 20. Izuku rattled off projections, unable to say what he knew was the truth. Tsu allowed her normally stoic face to smile, just a little. Gently, she used the hand of her unbroken arm to cup her partner's face, stopping his muttering completely. Wide, desperate green eyes born to resign black. I'm not going to make it, the frog girl said in understanding. Accepting the fact, as scary as it was, Tsu still wished she could say goodbye to her parents and siblings before she died. Her parents would be devastated, no doubt. They'd been so anxious when she'd made it clear she wanted to go to hero school, and now this. Samada would act unaffected during the day, but she knew her little brother would cry every night in his room afterward. Satsuki wouldn't understand why Big Sis never came home from school. The little tadpole was just too innocent for that. The thought caused a tear to pearl up. She'd at least hoped she'd have her first kiss before the end. "I'm not letting you die," Izuku suddenly declared, pulling out his penknife. He just had to save this girl. He couldn't lose another person. There was a slight chance if he acted now, his quirk might actually be able to help. Noticing the tiny knife in her partner's hand, Sa looked from the blade to Izuku in confusion. Karo? The world was beginning to fade in and out, so the frog girl decided maybe she was seeing and hearing things. "Despise me, forgive me. Resign yourself," Izuku intoned as he cut into his left wrist, causing Sa's eyes to widen in shock. "But I take this barbarous action to save your life. Now I want you to drink and live." Before the frog girl could react, the green-haired teen forced his bleeding wrist over her mouth, a rather large amount of the crimson liquid making it in. The two remained like that for a moment, neither moving. Perhaps it was her partner's words, perhaps it was an instinctual fear of death. Whatever the cause, Sa gave in to her impulse, and drank. She drank deeply, with the intent to survive the day. 20 minutes later, with the help of Okuko and Tokoyami and their quirks, the former rendering debris weightless for easy removal and the latter using dark shadow to handle large amounts of rubble, 1A was able to liberate their buried classmates without further issue. When the last concrete slab was raised and discarded, the class eagerly took in the forms of their missing number. Izuku cradled Tsu against his chest, what little had been left of his vest appearing to have been torn away to be used as bandages for the frog girl's wounds. Looking up at his classmates from where he crouched, on in the opened hollow, dried tears were clearly visible upon the green-haired teen's cheeks. It worked. Izuku breathed with a weak smile. It finally worked. The words meant nothing to the members of 1A, leaving them all standing confused in the ruined hall. While they did so, Tae stumbled down into the open space and took her customary place behind Izuku. Nobody noticed the zombie girl, stood just a little closer to the green-haired teen than normal. "Karo?" Tsu's croak received smiles from the other girls, before they noticed something odd. As the frog girl looked up at them with bleary eyes, there was no denying that what was once black was now red. "Can we go to the nurse's office now?" Tsu asked aloud. "I don't feel very good." The comment earned sighs of relief from all present. Momo, seeing she was the closest to the two rescued classmates, was the first to offer her hand in assistance. The mature girl recognized from his drooping gaze that Izuku was too weak and too tired to be of further help. "No." Tsu's scream startled everyone, the frog girl sounding as if Momo had just threatened to kill her. She clung to Izuku as if her life depended on it. "Wait, whatever you do, don't separate us," Izuku warned, holding Tsu closer to his chest even as his eyes cried out his pain at what he'd had to do. "I used my quirk on her, but I don't know what could happen if I'm not touching her to command my blood. I don't want her to die, or become like Tae." It was only now that the rest of 1A noticed the blood-covered rebar that rose from the once cavern-like, hungry teeth, their imaginations quickly filling in for them what had most likely happened. "Worry not, my friend," Tokoyami exclaimed, dark shadow rising from the avian teen's stomach. "Allow me to safely ferry you away from death's ever-reaching grasp." At the raven-headed boy's direction, the shadowy quirk entity shaped its hands into massive wing-like appendages. Gently, Izuku and Tsu were scooped up, dark shadow even carving into the ground effortlessly so the two wouldn't be jostled at all. All might watch this all unfold feeling equal parts prideful and guilty. His students had reacted like real heroes in their joint effort to save their peers, but the knowledge that he was partially responsible for this tragedy was suffocating him. If he hadn't had the idea of pitting Izuku and Bakugo against one another in an effort to have the two work out their mutual hatred. The symbol of peace shook his head, barely holding on to his smile. Now he needed to prepare himself to face what was sure to be a most horrible of battles. Dealing with the parents of the victims. Magnus. Next chapter will bring a lot of explanations about Izuku's quirk, as well as some bonding time with the lovely Fry. Chapter 6: A Sinister Aftermath. Nezu, the cute dog. Mouse? Bear. Animal with a quirk that made him more intelligent than 99% of humans, looked back at the reflection that stared up at him from its mug of coffee. Sitting before the quirked animal while he sat at his desk were the pro heroes Eraserhead and All Might, one looking beyond tired to the bone and the other, in his civilian form. Both men were currently teachers at his school and both currently wore the looks of guilty children who knew they were about to be scolded. As well they should. Their mistakes had ended up being nothing if not severe. Nezu, having been principal of the prestigious Hero Academy known far and wide as A for many years now, knew officially something must be done promptly to prevent a massive loss of said prestige. However, the quirked animal couldn't help but feel his duty should have resided more in helping his students, not his institution. So, what happened? Nezu asked, taking a sip of his coffee. He knew the general progression of events of course, but a more in-depth report, not to mention important context, of what had led to their near tragedy could only be beneficial. Toshinori raised his hand faster than Aizawa could begin his explanation. I made a judgment call, and it turned out to be wrong in the worst way, the skeletal man confessed. I thought if the boys were allowed to battle, they'd work out their differences in the end. Aizawa glared at the symbol of peace as he took all of the blame and attempted to shoulder complete responsibility for the event. The gruff teacher was beyond angry, feeling no pity for the pro-hero's currently decrepit form. It was his belief that even as a freshly minted teacher, the man should have seen something like this coming. It was part of their job after all. And why did you think your method could work? Nezu asked, his cutesy voice doing nothing to take away from the principal's obvious seriousness. The quirked animal's form almost visibly oozed aggravation and irritation. When I was a student, rivalries needed periodic confrontations to, vent frustrations at differences in rank or grades. Toshinori fumbled to explain. I thought this was just one of those cases. Aizawa face-palmed at the top pro-hero's words, catching Nezu's sharp eye. Something you'd like to share, Shouty-kun? The principal's words, while phrased as a question, were nonetheless tantamount to an order for the underground hero to speak. Aizawa didn't need further prompting. For future reference, I wanted to be absolutely clear that this wasn't a simple case of rivalry. The gruff teacher opened. There was no competition at all. Instead, it appears Midoriya regularly resisted acts of bullying and violence at the hands of Bakugo as far back as their early education. Toshinori paled at the information, unaware of how bad the two students' history truly was. Nezu narrowed his button eyes. The quirked animal hated many things about humans, but their capacity to inflict cruelty onto others for their own amusement was one he consigned some of his deepest hatreds to. If I'd been able to piece that information together from their clearly doctored files earlier, this entire fiasco could have been prevented, Aizawa continued, shoulders slumping. If I had, maybe my students wouldn't be in hospital beds right now. And thus it was that the gruff homeroom teacher of Class 1A revealed one of his longest-held secrets, that he did in fact feel something for his students. Just as quickly as it appeared, the concern was buried, the underground hero hiding the truth away to prevent those under his care from growing closer to him. He'd been hurt by such attachments before, and had sworn it would never happen again. I see. Nezu mused, a paw hand rubbing his chin. So, we can trace the root of this issue to an inexperienced teacher and tampered student files. I believe I understand. Toshinori and Aizawa glanced at each other before returning their attention to their boss. Whatever the quirked animal was thinking on, they were sure it was going to cause waves. In the meantime, Nezu broke from his musings, turning back to the men sitting at his desk. The parents of the victims were informed of their children's involvement in an accident, and while assurances of survival and location were provided, The mothers of course rightfully demanded access to their children. Toshinori and Aizawa gulped in sync. That was. No one has yet been told the entire truth of what occurred, Nezu pushed on, ignoring his teacher's looks of discomfort and dread. We need to decide on how to handle that. Who's going to meet them? The quirked animal was no one's fool. He knew whoever spoke with the, no doubt enraged and worried, mothers had a high chance of meeting an early demise. Toshinori began, starting to raise his hand again. The pro-hero accepted that he shouldn't avoid what he deserved. This whole near tragedy was his fault after all. I'll do it, Aizawa cut his co-worker off. It's my responsibility as homeroom teacher, and they deserve to hear the whole truth. The gruff man stood up, ready to leave the office. He hoped meeting these women didn't kill him, responsibility or not. Toshinori sat, flabbergasted, as his normally emotionless colleague began to walk away. Unexpected didn't even begin to cover what had just happened. The top pro hero had to take the burden back from his well-meaning associate. But I'm the one, you'll only make things worse, Aizawa said, cutting the symbol of peace off again. Sir, I'm sure you can find some other duties for All Might to be attending to right now. Leave this to me. And wish me luck. The underground hero closed the door behind him, marching off like a fearless soldier, and missed the solemn nod from the principal. Toshinori, meanwhile, was glad to see that the unexpected charity had just been a one-off, and his co-worker was otherwise acting normal. That being said, the symbol of peace still gazed at the door, feeling like he'd failed to save someone, failed because of an inconsequential distraction. It reminded the pro-hero of all the times he'd had the other heroes of it tell him there was nothing else he could have done to save more people, only this time his crippling injury wasn't at fault. Well now, Nezu said, pulling out a file from a drawer in his desk, since Shotokun's graciously gone to deal with the mothers of our victims, it appears we will now have to prepare to deal with the mother of our culprit. Here's to hoping the woman will be willing to listen to reason. The quirked animal's words made Toshinori wince. Even the skeletal man in all his social density knew a mother would defend her child against all reason. Medical office, 3 hours since the incident. The green-themed duo of Izuku and Tsu marveled at the advanced technology that filled every square inch of the room they found themselves in. It was a testament to us cutting-edge facilities. Both teens knew no hospital in Mujudafu would have been able to house the entire barrage of machines and scanners they'd had to suffer through in one place. Hell, even the IVs hooked into their arms were filled with a special in-house, high-quality nutrition-packed mixture. But really, all the gawking was actually a futile attempt to avoid acknowledging the position the two were currently in on their bed. I'm so happy you're alive, Izuku finally whispered, breaking the awkward silence. He'd lost his internal battle to contain his relief and lightly squeezed Tsu's hand. If he hadn't just gone through a life-and-death situation, the green-haired teen knew he'd have been too embarrassed to even do that. As it was, he was sitting half-naked in their hospital bed to allow better skin contact with the healed frog girl, so his face still resembled a tomato. What does that mean? Karo, Tsu asked, unable to hide her own embarrassment at the contact the two were sharing. In fact, the frog girl hadn't moved a muscle since the two had first made themselves comfortable on the bed, not daring to even turn around lest her savior see her rosy cheeks. Normally unflappable, the fact she was currently sitting between Izuku's legs while leaning against his bare chest, which was surprisingly soft, was causing Tsu's heart to flutter uncontrollably. The boy's warmth, which had at this point seeped into her bones, was almost mesmerizing. That I wouldn't be able to bear you dying? Izuku stuttered before cringing at his choice of words. No wait. That sounded weird. I meant, that I can keep seeing you. No, that's even weirder. That I get to see you smile. I am so dumb. Izuku fell into a muttering storm after that, and Tsu couldn't help but giggle at her savior's continued awkwardness. Perhaps the green-haired teen wouldn't be so tongue-tied, if the frog girl's own suit hadn't been half removed and replaced with a hospital gown to prevent loss of skin contact. "You make it sound as if you like me," Tsuyu found the courage to tease. While she knew the probability of a boy like Izuku actually finding her attractive or slim to none, the frog girl hoped her words would at least ease the tension between them a little. After all, who wouldn't find a mutant type like her, someone with the appearance of a frog, talking of desirability, humorous? Love at first sight, that romantic ideal all little girls seem to hope for, had always been an unreachable dream for her. As far back as her early school days, bullies had constantly reminded her how ugly she truly looked. "It can't be helped," Izuku replied with a sigh, "you're just too cute. And I love cute things." The response had hardly left the green-haired teen's lips before he entered full panic mode, his companion stiffening in his arms. "Did I just blurt that out loud?" Izuku asked, getting more and more flustered as he spoke. "I didn't mean that. I mean, you are pretty. Pretty to look at. No, I mean, you have a cute laugh. Wait. No. I'm shutting up before I ruin our friendship." The green-haired teen cut himself off and lowered his head, forgetting that Tsuyu's own was just below his chin as she rested on his chest. The end result. Izuku found his nose buried in the frog girl's hair, where the scent of her shampoo turned out to be quite pleasant. Too pleasant to immediately turn away from. Tsuyu lay there, stiff as a board, completely caught off guard. It was too much. Hadn't she just thought about how impossible it was for someone to find her looks appealing? Her mind turning away from that utter unlikelihood, the frog girl was at least able to agree that Izuku cutting himself off had prevented the awkwardness from affecting their new friendship. And then a completely uncharacteristic thought entered Tsuyu's head. If a simple attempt at teasing had elicited such a response from the green-haired teen, maybe she should tease him a little more? After all, genuine or not, it wasn't every day a member of the opposite sex called her pretty. "My laughter sounds like fast croaking. It's silly, but not cute," Tsuyu stated, before leaning in slightly with a playful look on her normally expressionless face. "Are you sure you didn't mean something else?" Izuku mumbled something into the frog girl's hair. Obviously unable to understand what was said, Tsuyu nudged her savior gently. The green-haired boy got the message though, and leaned back with a sigh of his own. "It sounded cute to me," Izuku said, flooring the girl in his arms. Tsuyu found herself forced to reconsider her earlier thoughts. Maybe there was a little ray of hope for someone like her after all. But even so, it wasn't worth the risk of such a new friendship that had just started. Tei's sudden and unexpected groan sounded an odd mix of playful and accusatory, earning a small leap from Tsuyu and a raised eyebrow from Izuku. It had come to no one's surprise that, after Izuku had passed out and been taken to Recovery Girl, the zombie girl had followed her master. And since his arrival she'd refused to budge even an inch from his side, going so far as to cling to the green-haired teen's left arm. When Tsuyu had noticed this, and that it left the poor boy with only one arm to hold her, the frog girl had briefly entertained the idea that Tei was jealous. "Really?" Izuku asked, skeptical of the information his first partner had just related. In spite of that, he could feel heat rushing to his cheeks once more, an elated feeling budding at the prospect of it being accurate. "That's not true," Tsuyu almost yelled. "I'm not blushing." The frog girl felt an ungodly amount of heat flooding her cheeks, more than she'd ever felt in her life. She also felt the stirrings of agitation. She'd thought herself safe, her savior unable to see her face in their current position. But no, that just had to be ruined by a zombie girl who apparently loved to report everything. And then Tsuyu realized what had just happened. Tei had groaned. And I just understood her. Karo. Tsuyu croaked in alarm, unable to decide if that was a good thing or not. It definitely wasn't normal though. Izuku smiled hesitantly, unsure if the frog girl was playing along or if she'd really been able to make sense of Tei's language. Really? The green-haired teen asked. It might have been an unknown effect of his quirk. He hadn't ever used it on a living person before. Unfortunately, before Tsuo had a chance to respond, Tae groaned again. This time, there was a recognizable questioning tinge to the sound. "Of course I think you are cute too," Izuku replied with a smile for the zombie girl, who returned to nuzzling his arm. "Don't be silly, Tae-chan." And that is how the three remained for a long while, content in their current positions. Outside Recovery Girl's nurse's office. For the past hour, Inko Midoriya and Buru Asui had been in a meeting with Shouta Aizawa, who'd spoken with them alone after they'd arrived. The mothers had been frantic after receiving notice that their respective children had been grievously injured during a training exercise, and had unloaded their emotional fury without mercy. The gruff pro-hero had then been subjected to maternal yelling, death threats, a declaration of intent to sue, and even the destruction of his favorite desk. Who'd known the Midoriya matriarch's quirk could lift something so heavy? All things considered, Aizawa had still believed himself extremely lucky. Things had gone far better than he'd expected at that point. "I want to reiterate that both students are, as of now, stable, conscious, and fully capable of communication," Aizawa had repeated in vain attempts to put the two mothers at ease. "Although, I will be the first to admit that this is in no way thanks to our own efforts." That last bit always earned the tired man penetrating glares from the women. "I want you to take us to our children," Inko had eventually yelled out. "My poor baby must be starving." The homely woman had been well aware of her son's limitations, and the backlash such quick and large-scale regeneration would have caused him. She'd brought with her a large bag packed with all manner of food and snacks for just that reason. But her efforts to see her baby had been met with little success until her last outburst. The green-haired woman's usually pleasant features might have spoken of a perpetual kindness, but the constant squeal of metal being bent and wood snapping told a much different story. An enormous fury long ago boxed away had been unearthed in the Midoriya matriarch. That her supposedly weak quirk had been oddly spiking in power since she'd received her call from UA was something the mother hadn't the time or inclination to capitalize on at the moment. "Your son seems more heroic to me than the teachers at this academy," Buru had said in response to her fellow mother's demand. "I would like to properly reward the boy for his effort to keep my precious daughter safe. Once they're recovered, let the Asui family treat you both to a proper reward, Karo." The words had been said in such a friendly and grateful tone, but Aizawa hadn't been able to forget the terrifying sight that the short woman had made when she'd first arrived. Thankfully, the pro-hero had made sure to step carefully from the beginning, acknowledging that these women were dangerous. One seemed to possess latent power she'd been unaware of, and the other held a position in society that could easily spell trouble for the academy. Only a fool crossed Buru Asui after all. The woman knew half of the best lawyers in Japan and employed the other half. In an attempt to calm the mothers, Aizawa had early on shown them the recordings of the exercise, audio included. It had been quite the eye-opener for the women. Inko hadn't been aware of how recklessly heroic her son could be, and Buru hadn't been able to believe her daughter's luck at finding such a knight in shining armor. The Asui matriarch had decided not to push the issue that day, but if Izuku Midoriya continued to prove his intentions were pure, then the woman had no problem with snagging the boy into an arranged marriage. Finding suitors for her treasured children would be hard enough as it was without letting such an opportunity pass. "Ah! The mothers are finally here," Recovery Girl greeted as the adults finally neared her office. Inko and Buru tensed. The elderly heroine was blocking access to the room by standing in front of the door. "Recovery Girl, this is Buru Asui and Inko Midoriya." Aizawa quickly made introductions before anything could be destroyed. "Please, explain to them the current situation their children are in. Meanwhile, I'll go check on the other party involved." The pro-hero retreated as speedily as a business walk would allow, leaving a frowning Recovery Girl in his wake to fend for herself. Luckily, the elderly heroine had more years of experience dealing with difficult patients and distraught parents than her co-worker had years of living under his belt. The sharp focus of the mother's hardly fazed her. Just how badly was my daughter wounded by that animal? Karo, Baru questioned, first to speak out after the gruff teacher's exit. The amphibian features of the woman's face, usually passive, were as stone-cold as her voice had turned. I hope you're giving my baby more than a mere 4. Inko followed her mother in arms almost immediately, the fierce frown twisting her normally bubbly visage, implying just how badly medics in the past had handled her baby's care. Recovery girl harumphed at the two mothers, slightly impressed that they'd been able to limit their questions and demands to one each. Usually this was the part where the concerned parent or parents would lose all control of themselves. The old nurse gave the women an acknowledging blink before beginning. For starters, Midoriya-san is hooped into 3 ifs, although I'll permit him real food now regardless of standard protocol, the elderly heroine said. As for Tsu, perhaps I should explain before we go in. Recovery girl gestured to the sofa that sat outside her office in the hallway. Both mothers stiffly refused the offer with increasing worry and anger. The elderly heroine huffed, but wasn't offended by the actions of her guests. First off, your daughter is doing well, Recovery girl said, directing her gaze to Baru. Most likely, she'll even be able to return home tomorrow. And at this point in time I can't see a reason why she couldn't attend classes by Monday. The frog woman noticeably sagged in relief at hearing that her eldest was going to recover just fine from her ordeal. One parent temporarily reassured, Recovery girl turned to the still anxiously waiting Inko. As for Midoriya-san, the elder heroine paused for a moment, considering how to word her next statement. To be honest, the only reason he's not going home this very moment is because we don't know what his quirk will do if he's separated from Asui-san. Baru, now confused, turned to her new friend and mother of her daughter's savior for an explanation. Inko's face, while still expressing her concern, had gained a sad, yet understanding aspect. Ah. That, the Midoriya matriarch murmured, almost half to herself. Shaking herself out of her thoughts, the woman turned to the other mother in the hallway. Izuku's only used his quirk like this once before, and the recipient's regeneration factor works at a faster speed when standing closer to him. My poor baby, he must be terrified right now of his friend turning into another Tate-chan. The explanation only added more questions the Asui matriarch wanted answers to, but for the moment she decided her focus was better spent gaining more understandable facts. To that end, Baru only nodded in response and turned back to Recovery girl. How badly was my daughter hurt? The frog woman asked the elderly heroine again. She hoped to get a better idea of what had happened from a medical professional. The grainy footage from the test cameras, damaged as they were, wasn't very helpful. What was the nature of the wounds and how much did this Izuku boy heal himself? Knowing her daughter had been seriously injured was bad enough, but not knowing the extent was almost worse for the Asui matriarch. She also needed to know just how much she should be rewarding the younger Midoriya for his actions. The professional mask Recovery girl had worn thus far slightly cracked. Even she wasn't looking forward to relating such injuries. But there was no way of avoiding it at this point, was there? Your daughter suffered a punctured stomach as well as multiple ruptures along her intestines, Recovery girl reported, already seeing the frog woman paling at the information. Her right arm shattered into 17 segments as well. There were also 5 vertebrae that received major fracturing, which caused her to lose the ability to feel anything below the waist. Inko watched as her new friend and fellow mother continued to appear more and more stricken with each word the elderly heroine spoke. The homely woman felt bad that she couldn't stand in solidarity with the frog woman, but her knowledge of injuries stopped at they barely affected her son. On top of those internal injuries, Asui-san experienced massive blood loss and the beginning stages of septic shock brought on by the toxins in her stomach seeping out and contaminating the surrounding organs. Recovery girl continued, regardless of the fact half her audience had frozen stiffer than a statue at her words. As much as it shames me to admit it, Asui-san, The only reason your daughter survived was Midraya's quick action. Baru had long since passed mortified and was well into numbed shock. What had just been described to her was no mere accidental quirk-use-related trauma brought on by a moment of emotional distress. The sheer scope of the injuries painted the culprit as one who was worse than a rabid animal. The Asui matriarch's eyes slid to the door the three women had been standing in front of. She feared what state she'd find her treasured daughter in when she went inside. This information was documented 3 hours ago. Recovery Girl broke Baru from her thoughts, but as of now Asui-san only has a scar on her abdomen, hairline fractures along the bones in her arm, and no discernible signs of internal hemorrhaging. Both mothers snapped their gazes to the elderly heroine in wonder at hearing how far the younger Asui's healing had progressed. The incident hadn't even occurred that long ago. Unfortunately, her stomach is a different story. Recovery Girl was quick to burst the two women's bubbles, never one to sugarcoat a situation. It's the only injury that hasn't properly healed yet. Although, considering how effective Midraya's quirk seems to be, something might change overnight, I suppose. Inko frowned at the news that her son's quirk hadn't fully regenerated every wound the two teens had sustained already. That could only mean one thing. That's much slower than Tate-chan's, the Midraya matriarch stated, drawing attention to herself. The homely mother's eyes widened. That means my baby's been starving since even before he had to help your daughter Asui-san. Left unspoken was the fact that this made sense to the elderly heroine. She'd long since recorded the phenomena of the regeneration factor speeding up when Midraya was hooked up to his IVs. Recovery Girl refused to risk angering the plump mother before her, as she really wanted to recruit her son for experimentation. A quirk like his was turning out to be ridiculously strong. Now, I'm about to let you both in, but before I do I need you to understand something. Recover Girl spoke, a silent warning clear to the now confused mothers. Since we don't know how Midraya's quirk would react to separation, I've kept the two in constant contact. Close contact. The two women weren't sure what that meant, but surely it wasn't something to be too concerned about? How close? Karo, Baru asked while Linko thought over what could possibly be wrong. They're sharing the bed, Recover Girl deadpanned at the exact moment she opened the door, having decided to come clean and rip the band-aid off as it were. Both mothers peeked into the room, curious to see how close their children had been. 4 hours now. Karo? The single croak from Baru was enough to catch the attention of the two teens on the bed, both immediately blushing at being seen so close to each other. As in atop one another. Oh my! Inko gasped, though secretly the homely mother smiled internally. Seeing her darling boy be so daring as to hold a cute girl close to his bare chest was heartening for the oft-worried mother. Hesitantly, Izuku looked up from where his face had been, buried in Tsu's hair. The green-haired teen fully expected to see the Asui matriarch going ballistic at the scene she'd walked into. I'm in trouble, aren't I? Izuku asked, worried voice tiny. However, even as anxious as he was, the hero in training never allowed his grip on Tsu to waver. In fact, the green-haired teen's hug on the frog girl only tightened, preventing any possibility of mishaps. Before any of the living occupants of the room could answer, the single undead present decided to put in her own 2 yen. Ow! Te groaned loudly, letting go of Izuku's arm. The zombie girl lurched forward, standing between her master and the now startled mothers. Karo. Baru croaked again, this time in obvious fright as she jumped and hid behind Dinko. The frog woman hadn't expected her first encounter with a zombie to happen like this. As quickly as Te had moved, and Baru reacted, Inko took command of the situation. The homely mother calmly stepped forward and bopped the zombie girl on the head. Oh hush now, Te. Inko said with a half-smile, you're going to scare Baru-san. She doesn't know you yet and that behavior is uncalled for. Now, would you please get us some chairs? Izuku won't be able to feed you until I've fed him. To the shock and surprise of the Asui matriarch, and the observing Recover Girl, The zombie girl only gave a huff at the request before slowly leaving the room. In Principal Nezu's office, Mitsuki Bakugo sat, speechless at what she'd just witnessed. Before her very eyes she'd watched recorded video plainly show her son, acting like a deranged psychopath, unleash utter destruction on his classmates. In the moments before the devastation, Katsuki's eyes had been wild with bloodlust, and after, when the massive and lethal attack had been carried out, manic pleasure. All Might's prior announcement of the exercise's completion had not only been clear even in the recording, but her son's reaction left no doubt he'd heard it. The fact that he then still decided to carry on with his assault was undeniable. Defending Katsuki was effectively impossible, and to the Ashen Mother, even damage control seemed to be a losing battle. So, how are the victims? Mitsuki asked, hating to use the word but knowing any attempt to downplay her son's actions would likely result in harsher punishment. Are the affected students doing okay? The Ashen Mother didn't try to kid herself. She knew there was little hope in this situation. The hammer was soon to fall. Glancing at her son, now clad in heavy arm, hand, and wrist restraints to prevent use of his quirk, her fears were anything but put at ease. The explosive blonde even had weighted chains locked to his legs to prevent him from fleeing. Young Midoriya appeared to have taken the worst of the attack, but he's perfectly fine now, All Might answered, that is, sans the constant complaints about his hunger. The news gave the troubled woman a small feeling of respite. The ashen blonde sat back, a weak smile on her face. Thank goodness, Mitsuki cheered the small victory. I'm so glad Ko-chan's boy is all right. The Ashen Mother felt a flicker of hope. Surely, at the very least, her best friend would be willing to forgive her and her son. She'd done it so many times before. Out of the corner of her eye, Mitsuki saw her son bite his lip, hard, a clear sign he was forcing himself to keep quiet. She highly doubted he wanted to apologize. As for young Ida, he suffered slightly less. Mortal wounds, Nezu picked up. The quirked animal's chosen words did their job, reminding the Bakugo woman with a start that just because Izuku Midoriya had already healed didn't mean he hadn't been grievously injured. He was taken to his family's private hospital of choice for treatment of a concussion and dislocated shoulder. Mitsuki sighed in relief again. Injuries like that, while their circumstance was dire, wouldn't see her son in prison. Tensai Ida, the Ida family's current public face and de facto head of house, has made it very clear he intends for you to pay all medical fees, Nezu continued, forcing down a vindictive smirk at the now dread-filled eyes of the elder Bakugo. He decided to hammer in another nail. He has also stated he will side with the Asui family should they decide to pursue legal action. The worst-case scenario hit Mitsuki like the horrible nightmare it was. Katsuki's eyes widening at the news only worked to confirm her fears. Suddenly the chains on her son seemed like they'd never be removed. I understand. The Ashen Mother whispered half-heartedly. Surely there had to be something. Anything. That could lessen the troubles piling upon her family? As if to prove how erroneous her wishful thinking was to be, Nezu passed Mitsuki a manila folder. Before she even opened it, a knot formed in her stomach. Whatever was bad enough the principal of it would rather it be read than spoken surely wasn't good news. Speaking of the Asui, was all Nezu said. Mitsuki opened the folder, and immediately wished she hadn't. Inside was a detailed list of all of the injuries her son's classmate had suffered, as reported, directly after the event. Each was worse than the last, and whatever quivering hope the Ashen Mother had held vanished. Now she only saw a future of darkness, not only for her son, but for her entire family. Fortunately, Midoriya-san managed to successfully utilize his quirk while the two were trapped by debris. Nezu broke Mitsuki's dismal thoughts, allowing the woman more time before her world came crashing down. She will not only survive, but may even make a full recovery. Nezu raised a paw hand before the hopeful look on the blonde mother's face could return to more than a flicker. This doesn't mean that your son's actions will be forgiven or forgotten, the quirked animal said forcefully. Psychological damage has yet to be determined, for any of the three, and that's not even mentioning the Asui family's absolute right to press criminal charges. Seeing his point had been made when Mitsuki's shoulders slumped, Nezu took a breath. And then there's the fact that our own rules will fully apply here, the principal revealed. That means for all intents and purposes, Katsuki Bakugo will be expelled from UA, forthwith as soon as the appropriate authorities have concluded their investigation of the scene and processed all available evidence. The blonde mother felt conflicted. On one hand, she was incredibly thankful for the cinnamon roll her best friend called a son. On the other, it was devastating to hear her own son's dream had just been ended so completely. At least there was the faintest of hopes that her family could survive the ordeal now. And maybe something could still be done for Katsuki? Is there a way, please reconsider? Mitsuki choked out in a broken voice. It might be too much to ask, but a second chance could. Katsuki watched as, for the first time in his life, his proud and strong barbarian of a mother was reduced to a weak, pleading mouse. It didn't sit well with the explosive blonde, and if he'd been able to, he'd have cursed up a storm to get the hag back to her normal self. This wasn't her, she never begged. What the hell? Mitsuki swallowed her ego, venturing to ask for her son to have a chance he didn't deserve. For all the faults between them, she did love him. Unfortunately for the Ashen mother, her appeal came at the exact moment a rather gruff-looking man entered the office. No, Aizawa bit out, an unusual amount of emotion in his rough voice. And if it were up to me, your spawn would be thrown into Tartarus for the rest of his life. Age be damned. The harsh statement received mixed reactions around the room. Nezu only sighed at his prickly teacher's words, though he knew the underground hero's history and why he would say such a thing. Mitsuki paled at the mere mention of her son being locked away in the world's worst official criminal cesspool. Bakugo silently fumed, itching to blow something up. An All Might? Aizawa-kun, isn't that taking things a bit too far? The symbol of peace asked, trying to calm the sudden tension that had gripped the room. After all three students will. Katsuki Bakugo voluntarily attacked his fellow students with lethal force after their exercise had been ended, appearing to be quite pleased with himself during and afterward the assault. Aizawa cut the number one hero off, not having any of the muscle-bound idiot's mercy. He did this either fully aware of the consequences, or while unable to think rationally about them. Either way, this means that the only alternative I see is to have him committed to a psychiatric institution. The underground hero's harsh evaluation caused both Bakugos to wince. Be that as it may, Nezu interrupted his disputing teachers. As the principal of this prestigious academy, I've decided to allow a single chance for this student of ours that's fallen from the heroic path. He'll take it. Mitsuki quickly accepted, the troubled mother not even willing to give the quirked animal time to explain, or her son to say anything. Nezu shook his head, a humorless chuff escaping him at the eagerness of the Ashen woman to salvage some future for her child. He'd looked over Mitsuki Bakugo's file before the woman had arrived, and even with his distaste for most humans, the principal found himself somewhat pitying the woman for the suffering her son's actions was causing her. I appreciate the enthusiasm, but allow me to fully explain before attempting to agree to something only your son can, Nezu said. First of all, Bakugo-san will be removed from the hero course forthwith and instead be enrolled in the general studies track. Concurrently, any use of his quirk, under any circumstance, will be completely restricted until he passes a battery of evaluations from our own psychiatrists. After that, he will be placed under provisory surveillance until such a time that he has earned the right to return to the path of heroes. And do keep in mind, this is only in addition to any and all punishments the authorities decide. He did cause potentially lethal damage to 3 of our students after all. As the quirked animal explained his terms, Katsuki felt his ever-present rage flare to life. The explosive blonde was more than ready to call bullshit on this whole farce and demand a return to his rightful place. That is, until he saw the absolutely terrifying glare the hag was directing at him. In the face of that supreme power, Katsuki was forced to bow his head and accept any and all terms that came with the deal. He accepts, Mitsuki repeated, placing a heavy hand on her son's non-responsive shoulder. The brooding blonde gave a forced nod. Nezu clapped his paw hands together, expecting nothing less from what he knew of the two ashen blondes before him. Excellent. Now, all we have left is to wait for the mothers of your son's victims, the quirked animal revealed. They more than deserve to have their say in all this. And of course, should they choose to press charges, we won't be able to do much with Rikugo-san. We can't have a student in the hero course that's been convicted of such violent crimes. We'd be pushing it with the restriction order as it is. Mitsuki froze, despair washing over the ashen mother once again at the revelation. Aizawa just snorted at the principal's last-minute disclosure. Back at the nurse office, Baru Asui watched silently as her fellow mother interacted with the two teenagers on the hospital bed. It was easy to notice the closeness of the Midoriya family. Their warm actions spoke of much love and support. The frog woman was surprised at how protective the young green-haired boy was even after only being friends with her daughter for less than a day. When Tsuo had told her about a classmate that could control zombies, Baru hadn't known what to expect. The cinnamon roll that was holding her daughter so fiercely had definitely not been in her ballpark though. The most unexpected detail of the scene, however, was how happy her precious daughter looked. Here, this is the last one I had time to make, Inko said as she handed Izuku his fourth burger in the row. The green-haired teen wolfed the home-cooked meal down like he'd been starving for days. Tomorrow I'll cook up something more filling when you get home. Tsuo giggled at the display of her savior chowing down so heartily. That was another thing Baru hadn't expected to come out of today, hearing a sound she hadn't heard in months. Inko had warned the frog woman that Izuku's regeneration was limited by the amount of nutrients he had in his body, and if the recording of the exercise was anything to go by, the boy had to have been extremely weak when he'd gone and saved her daughter, just like her mother Narms had said earlier. Taking such a potentially life-threatening risk, for the sake of just a friend? It was incredible to think about. Ah! Te groaned while holding up a bottle of water toward Izuku. The zombie girl obviously was trying to help her master, but showed no hostility toward Tsuo when she was the one that took the offering from her hands. Baru had originally been fascinated by the reanimated corpse because if she hadn't known better, with its obedient demeanor and lifelike appearance, the frog woman would have easily believed Tay was only a girl with Down syndrome. The zombie girl's existence was also troubling, as the mother had quickly noticed the change to her daughter's eyes. So, what happened to this girl could still happen to my daughter? Baru finally asked, hating to put such a stressful question out there. But as a mother she needed to know. It was Izuku who answered, looking equally as distraught as he did relieved. I don't think so, ma'am. When I failed to save Tay, she'd already died before my quirk could repair any of the damage, the green-haired teen explained. And she didn't seem to want to survive. Suchan though, she fought for her life while I gave her my blood. Since she's herself now, I can't imagine her turning into a mindless zombie. She's also very much alive. The hero in training did his best to convey his thoughts, not failing to notice Tsuo leaning into him a little more as he did so. Unfortunately, that same observational prowess missed the frog girl's mother staring intently at her daughter's action. And her red eyes? Baru asked, more out of curiosity than worry. A simple change of eye color was a lot easier to accept than her daughter suffering crippling wounds. Or death. The frog woman was also careful to keep a piece of her intuition to herself. The zombie girl wasn't as mindless as others believed her to be. She was an office worker, and she had faith in her ability to spot a mindless drone or a brain-dead person. Previously sitting at her desk, watching the scene unfold, Recovery Girl took the opportunity to reintroduce herself into the conversation. I can answer that, the elderly heroine announced, drawing the attention of everyone present. Midoriya-san's blood is actually made of cells that appear to be almost sentient. They can form symbiotic relationships with organic structures they come into contact with, and since the eyes are connected to the brain, it appears the cells recognize the entire ophthalmic apparatus as an invaluable resource against external threats. Therefore, portions of the quirked blood relocated to the Asui-san's optic organs and related nerves to ensure a redundant communication network with the brain and the rest of the cells. Seeing she lost most of her audience, Recover Girl chuckled and waved a gloved hand, getting to the point. Once Midoriya-san's blood is purged from Asui-san's system, her eyes should return to their normal color. If the elderly heroine happened to forget to relate some of the other potential she discovered with the green-haired boy's quirk, well, she was old after all. Oh my. I knew there was a better explanation to it than your blood just repaired stuff. Inko's cheerful voice broke the relieved silence that followed Recovery Girl's words. The homely mother found great delight in the news, seeing a much brighter future for her son. Of course, she'd never suggest getting rid of Tay. The zombie girl had become quite useful at home by taking over many of the simple and repetitive chores. He still needs to stay in contact with the girl though, Recovery Girl added before anyone could get distracted further. At this point in time, there's no way to predict how his quirk will act without proper direction, or in this case, direct and active concern in regards to keeping Asui-san intact as a person. Regardless, if her healing continues at its current progression, her wounds will be completely gone by tomorrow. I advise waiting to test separating them until then. The elder heroine was expecting her words to garner a few reactions, not the least of which was an angry Asui matriarch upset about her daughter participating in such a lengthy skinship session with basically a stranger. She was surprised, therefore, to find the frog woman's expression much more understanding than she'd foreseen. I understand, Baru said, accepting the news as graciously as possible. Inko-chan, your son has a truly marvelous quirk, both powerful and miraculous. I'm grateful for his existence, because without him no one would have been able to save my treasured daughter. Please allow me to treat you both to lunch tomorrow, as I have a feeling Izuku here will still be hungry. Karo. You're too kind, Baru-chan. We'd gladly take you up on your offer, Inko said cheerfully, glad her new friend accepted her son so readily. I think it'd be a great time to reintroduce ourselves, as I'm sure our children have a lot to tell us. The homely woman's schoolgirl-like giggling worried the two teenagers, who could only watch as their mothers plodded away. Now, while I'm sure that you're both beyond reassured about the well-being of your children, Recovery Girl trailed off as she gently guided the two mothers to the door. If you would please head to the principal's office, there are some legal matters that need your attention. Acquiescing to the elderly heroine's direction, Baru and Inko allowed themselves to be led from the room, neither mother even thinking to leave a warning about good behave. Both were either confident that they'd raised their child with manners, or didn't mind any misbehavior that could occur. Now, alone again, Su and Izuku returned to their previous position, the frog girl tucked as tightly as possible under the green-haired teen's arms. I think mother likes you, Su eventually said after a minute of silence, earning a chuckle from her savior. I would certainly hope so, Izuku replied, smiling down at the girl in his arms. I don't think I'd survive being told to stop being your friend. The words caused a warmth to travel through the frog girl, and Izuku unconsciously tightening the arm he had around her stomach didn't help. Tsu felt herself blush. Izuku-kun. What happens if we need to stay like this to prevent me from going? Eh? Tsu asked, suddenly rising a concerning possibility. So far, it had been a dream come true for the frog girl to be treated like a normal person for so long, to not hear any remarks about her amphibious appearance, to not feel rejected for her looks. But even so, this had been a controlled environment until now, and once the true extent of her savior's quirk came to light, Tsu knew without a doubt there'd be other girls who saw Izuku as attractive. She feared becoming a burden to her savior if she had to stay close to him at all times, especially if he had other, prettier girls clamoring for his attention. Tsu-chan, if that happens, Then I'd gladly stay by your side for the rest of my life, Izuku replied, resting his chin on the frog girl's shoulder. The innocent action caused Tsu's heart to skip a beat. Said heart was forced by some internal power to return to its proper tempo. You really mean that? Tsu asked, ready to kiss her savior's cheek. She was so full of thanks. In fact, she moved to do just that. Yes, I do, Izuku reaffirmed, raising his head back up to get a good look at the girl in his arms. He wanted to show her how confident he felt about his actions. Then the green duo felt their noses collide. Their eyes met, time stopped, and the world fell away for the teenagers as they realized how close their faces were. Their lips had opened due to synchronized gasps of surprise, and warm breath ghosted across their respective cheeks. Izuku couldn't move, his hormones waging a rebellion inside. He craved to lower his face that final half-inch, but his strong morals kept him from succumbing. The green-haired teen knew this instant had just been an accident. Tsu felt oddly warm all over, and her heartbeat sang to her a sweet song of tilting her head back, just that final half-inch. She should close the distance, seal the gap, and claim her savior before any other girl had the chance. It was completely irrational, and probably a result of the so-called suspended bridge effect. But the frog girl felt her body begin to move anyway. And really, she didn't feel like stopping it. Midoriya, my friend. I have recovered for you your withheld items. Our classmates Hagakure and Ashido proclaimed their intentions of returning Asui-sans to her, Tokoyami announced dramatically as he entered the room. Have they fulfilled their vow yet? The raven-headed teen immediately froze upon seeing the position Izuku and Tsu were in, before looking away hastily out of respect. He ended up looking right at the aforementioned girls, who'd already been in the room. Oh. There they are. Tokoyami deadpanned, staring with clear disapproval at Mina Ashido, who had her phone aimed at the pair in their bed. We didn't want to interrupt, came Taru's shy voice, unused to being caught in situations like this. The invisible girl wished not for the first time that she'd taken her clothes off, when she'd had the chance. Mina, meanwhile, giggled like a madwoman. That's right. This was getting really good. The pink-hued girl exclaimed. This is going to be a very popular vid, hey. The acid user was completely unprepared for her phone to be yanked from her hand by something incredibly fast and agile. Looking around, Mina found that Tsu had used her tongue to retrieve the device, only to pass it to Izuku. I'm deleting this. Izuku deadpanned, poking at the phone's touch screen. He easily erased the video before going through the options and expunging everything from the last hour, just in case his pink-hued classmate had thought to take pictures too. Seeing her phone being snapped away, Mina made a mad dash to recover her phone. After only a step, a now angry-looking Tate tackled her to the ground. Tsu decided her best option was to cover her face, although that did nothing to hide her massive blush. Even with only knowing Mina as long as she had, the frog girl knew the acid user was the kind of person to relentlessly tease her about this incident in public. By next week, everyone will have heard in some form or another about what had transpired in the nurse's office. As she watched her fellow gothically pocketed her own phone, the invisible girl decided not to say anything about her own haul, since she'd actually been able to take pictures before Tokoyami had entered the room, and just enjoy the fact that she had an incredible source of teasing material for later. There was gold in her pocket, Taru knew, and she wasn't about to miss her spot at the party. Magnus, unfortunately I don't know anything about the Asui family, so I hope this sounds believable. For those who like to say that I bring in romance too quickly, bear in mind that these are hormonal teenagers that had faced a near-death experience, and that the suspended bridge effect is a thing.